Reality hides nightmares no witness can explain. Imagine discovering evidence that defies science, memory, even time itself. Every vanished traveler, impossible signal, and sealed chamber whispers one terrifying possibility. What if humanity overlooked the clues because accepting them would shatter everything believed forever before tonight changes your perception completely onward? The wind moves quietly across the rugged mountains where the ancient kingdom of Urartu once stood. Broken stone foundations emerge from the earth, surrounded by steep valleys and distant ridges that have watched civilizations rise and disappear. Somewhere within this landscape stood Musasir, a sacred city whose name survives in scattered inscriptions, royal records, and unanswered questions. Little remains today to reveal its full appearance, yet its reputation has endured for more than 2,000 years. It was a place of devotion, ceremony, and extraordinary wealth, a sanctuary believed to have guarded treasures unlike any other in the ancient Near East. Musasir occupied a unique position between powerful kingdoms, serving not only as a religious center, but also as a crossroads of cultures, trade, and political influence. At the heart of the city stood an impressive temple dedicated to the god Haldi, the supreme deity of Urartu. Ancient rulers visited the sanctuary to seek divine favor before military campaigns, while pilgrims likely arrived bearing gifts intended to honor their gods. Gold, silver, finely crafted weapons, ceremonial vessels, and precious ornaments gradually accumulated within its walls over generations. Much of what historians know about these sacred treasures comes from an unexpected source: the records of their enemies. In 714 BC, the Assyrian king Sargon II launched a campaign against Urartu. His inscriptions describe the capture of Musasir and the removal of immense quantities of treasure from the temple of Haldi. Relief carvings discovered in the palace at Dur Sharukin appear to illustrate the temple itself, depicting soldiers carrying away statues, shields, furniture, and countless valuable objects. These images remain among the most significant visual references connected to the lost sanctuary. Yet even these detailed accounts leave important questions unanswered. Exactly how much treasure filled the temple? Were the royal inscriptions intended as accurate inventories, or did they exaggerate the victory to glorify the Assyrian king? Ancient rulers frequently celebrated their triumphs with dramatic language. Distinguishing historical reality from political propaganda is often difficult, especially when only fragments of evidence survive. Archaeologists continue searching for the precise location of Musasir. Several sites in the mountainous regions near the modern borders of Iraq, Iran, and eastern Turkey have been proposed, but no universally accepted identification has emerged. Without certainty about the city's location, uncovering the temple itself becomes an even greater challenge. Every excavation adds another piece to the puzzle, while simultaneously revealing how much remains unknown. Some researchers believe the sacred treasures described by Sargon II were indeed transported to Assyria, where they were eventually melted down, reused, or dispersed over centuries of conflict. Precious metals rarely remain untouched through history. Gold can be recast, silver reshaped, and ceremonial objects transformed into entirely different creations. If this occurred, the legendary wealth of Musasir may have vanished not through disappearance, but through countless acts of recycling across empires. Others consider another possibility. What if the temple custodians anticipated the invasion? Sacred objects were often viewed as living symbols of divine authority rather than simple valuables. Faced with approaching armies, would priests have attempted to conceal their most revered relics? Hidden chambers beneath temple floors, mountain caves known only to initiates, or carefully sealed vaults beyond the city walls have all entered historical speculation. Although no convincing archaeological evidence confirms such ideas, neither have they been completely ruled out. The reliefs themselves also invite careful examination. They appear remarkably detailed, showing architectural features that scholars continue to analyze today. Were the artists recording an actual structure with surprising accuracy, or were symbolic elements included to emphasize imperial dominance? Every carved line becomes another source of debate, reminding us that even visual evidence may contain layers of interpretation. Adding further complexity is the limited written record left by Musasir's own inhabitants. Most surviving descriptions originate from neighboring powers whose interests were political or military. The voices of the priests, craftsmen, and ordinary people who once walked the temple courts have largely disappeared. Their silence creates space for uncertainty, allowing imagination to stand beside evidence without replacing it. Modern technology has expanded the search in unexpected ways. Satellite imagery, remote sensing, and advanced landscape analysis have identified locations worthy of further investigation. Hidden foundations buried beneath centuries of sediment or concealed beneath remote mountain terrain may still await discovery. Every season of fieldwork raises cautious optimism while reinforcing the patience that archaeology demands. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not simply where the treasures went, but what they truly represented. Were they merely magnificent collections of wealth, or did they preserve religious traditions, artistic achievements, and forgotten knowledge whose meaning has faded with time? Somewhere beneath layers of earth and history, the story of Musasir may still be incomplete, waiting for a single discovery to illuminate what has remained hidden for more than 27 centuries. If the sacred treasures of Musasir remain one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries, then an even deeper question naturally follows. What became of the city itself? After all, treasures can be carried away, hidden, or destroyed. But how does an entire capital, once known to neighboring empires, gradually fade until even its exact location becomes uncertain? Morning mist often settles over the rugged mountain valleys once shared by the kingdoms of Urartu, Assyria, and their many rivals. Sharp ridgelines cast long shadows across narrow passes, while rivers quietly carve their way through ancient stone. It is a landscape that rewards patience. Beneath layers of soil, scattered rock, and centuries of silence, countless traces of forgotten settlements still wait to be uncovered. Somewhere within these mountains, many historians believe, stood Musasir, a city once important enough to influence kings, receive pilgrims, and command the attention of one of the ancient world's greatest military powers. Unlike many famous capitals of antiquity, Musasir has never been identified with complete certainty. Its name survives in royal inscriptions, military records, and religious accounts, yet the city itself remains frustratingly elusive. Ancient texts describe it as a sacred center closely connected with the kingdom of Urartu, although it may have maintained a distinct political identity at different moments in its history. This unique position placed Musasir at the crossroads of competing kingdoms, making it both influential and vulnerable. The best-known written description comes from the Assyrian king Sargon II, whose campaign of 714 BC recorded the capture of Musasir after a dramatic military expedition through difficult mountain terrain. His inscriptions portray the conquest as one of his greatest victories, emphasizing the city's wealth and the seizure of the famous temple dedicated to Haldi. Reliefs carved inside his palace appear to show the temple itself, offering historians one of the few visual glimpses associated with Musasir. Yet there is something striking about these records. Although the campaign is described in considerable detail, the geographical clues remain surprisingly difficult to match with certainty. Rivers have changed course. Ancient roads disappeared long ago. Place names evolved as languages shifted and populations moved. Even mountains that appear permanent can become surprisingly difficult to identify when viewed through descriptions written nearly 3,000 years ago. Several archaeological sites across the mountainous border regions of modern Iraq, Iran, and eastern Turkey have been proposed as possible locations. Each offers intriguing evidence. Some contain impressive fortifications. Others reveal temples, administrative buildings, or material linked to Urartian culture. Yet none has produced the decisive combination of inscriptions, architecture, and artifacts needed to convince the entire scholarly community. This uncertainty has encouraged many competing interpretations. Some researchers suggest that Musasir may have been smaller than later traditions imagined, functioning primarily as a religious sanctuary rather than a sprawling political capital. Others argue the opposite, proposing that much of the surrounding urban settlement simply remains buried beneath unexplored terrain or lies beneath villages and landscapes that have changed dramatically over the centuries. Natural forces may also have contributed to its disappearance. Earthquakes have shaped this mountainous region for thousands of years. Landslides can bury entire structures beneath rock and sediment in remarkably short periods. Rivers shift, floodplains expand, and abandoned buildings gradually return to the earth. Without continuous occupation, even important cities can slowly vanish from view until only faint traces survive beneath the surface. There are also more speculative possibilities that continue to circulate among independent researchers and enthusiasts of ancient history. Could portions of Musasir still lie hidden beneath unexplored caves, or beneath slopes that have never been systematically excavated? Some have wondered whether later civilizations unknowingly built directly over its remains, preserving fragments beneath newer foundations. Others point to the remarkable persistence of local traditions and place names, suggesting that memories of the city may have survived in oral history long after written records disappeared. As the mountains of Musasir slowly disappear behind us, another mystery emerges from an entirely different landscape. Instead of hidden valleys and forgotten temples, we now turn toward the restless waters of the eastern Mediterranean, a sea that has connected civilizations for thousands of years, while quietly concealing some of history's greatest disappearances. Among its oldest unanswered questions is the identity of a people who seemed to arrive without warning, alter the course of empires, and then almost vanish from history: the Sea Peoples. The Mediterranean at sunset can appear remarkably peaceful. Gentle waves reflect fading light, while distant coastlines blur into the horizon. Merchant vessels once crossed these waters carrying copper, tin, grain, textiles, and ideas between powerful kingdoms. During the Late Bronze Age, this maritime network linked Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, Canaan, and many other societies into an interconnected world. Yet around the end of the 13th century BC, that world began to fracture with astonishing speed. Cities burned, trade routes collapsed, palaces that had stood for centuries were abandoned, entire political systems disappeared within only a few generations. Historians continue to debate the reasons behind what is often called the Bronze Age collapse, but one recurring name appears throughout ancient Egyptian records: the Sea Peoples. They are described not as a single nation, but as a collection of groups arriving by both land and sea. Egyptian inscriptions, particularly those commissioned by Pharaoh Ramesses III, depict fierce battles against invading forces whose ships crowded the coastline. Reliefs carved into temple walls show distinctive helmets, feathered headdresses, round shields, and ox-drawn carts carrying families and possessions. These details suggest something more complex than a simple military invasion. Were these organized armies, displaced refugees, migrating communities, or perhaps all of these at once? The ancient texts provide names such as the Sherdan, Shekelesh, Denyen, Checker, Peliset, and several others. Yet matching these names with known populations remains one of archaeology's. As the mountains of Musasir slowly disappear behind us, another mystery emerges from an entirely different landscape. Instead of hidden valleys and forgotten temples, We now turn toward the restless waters of the eastern Mediterranean, a sea that has connected civilizations for thousands of years, while quietly concealing some of history's greatest disappearances. Among its oldest unanswered questions is the identity of a people who seemed to arrive without warning, alter the course of empires, and then almost vanish from history: the Sea Peoples. The Mediterranean at sunset can appear remarkably peaceful. Gentle waves reflect fading light, while distant coastlines blur into the horizon. Merchant vessels once crossed these waters carrying copper, tin, grain, textiles, and ideas between powerful kingdoms. During the Late Bronze Age, this maritime network linked Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, Canaan, and many other societies into an interconnected world. Yet around the end of the 13th century BC, that world began to fracture with astonishing speed. Cities burned, trade routes collapsed, palaces that had stood for centuries were abandoned, entire political systems disappeared within only a few generations. Historians continue to debate the reasons behind what is often called the Bronze Age collapse, but one recurring name appears throughout ancient Egyptian records: the Sea Peoples. They are described not as a single nation, but as a collection of groups arriving by both land and sea. Egyptian inscriptions, particularly those commissioned by Pharaoh Ramesses III, depict fierce battles against invading forces whose ships crowded the coastline. Reliefs carved into temple walls show distinctive helmets, feathered headdresses, round shields, and ox-drawn carts carrying families and possessions. These details suggest something more complex than a simple military invasion. Were these organized armies, displaced refugees, migrating communities, or perhaps all of these at once? The ancient texts provide names such as the Sheridan, Shekelesh, Denyen, Checker, Peliset, and several others. Yet matching these names with known populations remains one of archaeology's greatest challenges. Linguistic similarities offer clues but rarely provide certainty. Every proposed identification seems to answer one question while raising another. Among these groups, the Peliset have attracted particular attention. Egyptian inscriptions record their arrival along the southern Levantine coast after conflicts with Egypt. Archaeological excavations in parts of what is now Palestine have uncovered settlements dating to this period that contain pottery styles, architecture, and dietary habits differing from earlier local traditions. Some scholars see these discoveries as evidence that migrants from the Aegean or surrounding regions established new communities after the upheavals of the Bronze Age. Yet even this interpretation remains incomplete. Recent genetic studies suggest that at least some coastal populations carried ancestry connected to southern Europe, but the genetic signature appears to diminish within only a few generations as newcomers mixed extensively with local inhabitants. Rather than replacing existing populations, the evidence points toward gradual integration. Cultures blended, languages evolved, traditions merged until clear distinctions slowly disappeared. If this picture is accurate, then who were the final survivors of the Sea Peoples? Did isolated communities preserve fragments of older customs long after written records fell silent? Could descendants have continued living along the Mediterranean coast without recognizing themselves as members of the groups described in Egyptian inscriptions? History often remembers kingdoms and dynasties, yet ordinary families frequently leave quieter legacies that become almost invisible over time. Some historians argue that the term Sea Peoples may itself oversimplify a far more complicated reality. Instead of one coordinated migration, there may have been numerous independent movements triggered by drought, famine, earthquakes, political instability, and the collapse of long-distance trade. Communities facing crisis could have traveled in different directions, occasionally joining together when survival demanded cooperation. Others have explored more speculative possibilities. Could some of these maritime groups have originated far beyond the regions usually considered by mainstream archaeology? Ancient legends from various Mediterranean cultures speak of vanished islands, distant western homelands, and catastrophic floods that forced populations to seek new lands. While no direct archaeological evidence confirms such accounts as the origin of the Sea Peoples, they continue to inspire investigation into how much of early migration history may still remain undiscovered beneath coastal waters now submerged by changing sea levels. There is also the enduring mystery of the records themselves. Most surviving descriptions were written by those who fought against these newcomers. Like many royal inscriptions, they celebrated victory and reinforced political authority. The Sea Peoples left few writings that can be confidently identified as their own. Their voices, beliefs, and motivations remain largely absent, forcing historians to reconstruct their story through fragments preserved by others. Marine archaeology continues to expand this search. Shipwrecks resting beneath the Mediterranean, submerged harbors, and long-forgotten coastal settlements occasionally reveal unexpected evidence of trade, migration, and cultural exchange. Every discovery reminds researchers that the ancient shoreline looked very different from today's coast. Entire ports now lie underwater, concealed beneath centuries of sediment and shifting seas. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not where the Sea Peoples came from, but how quickly they became part of the societies they once seemed to transform. Their distinct identities gradually faded into the wider tapestry of Mediterranean history, leaving behind only scattered names carved into stone, fragments of pottery, and unanswered questions. Somewhere beneath the waves, or beneath the foundations of ancient coastal cities, the story of their final survivors may still be waiting, preserved in silence until the next discovery brings another forgotten chapter to light. As the story of the Sea Peoples slowly fades into the horizon, another civilization emerges from the rugged heart of the ancient Near East. Unlike the maritime cultures that crossed open waters, this mystery is rooted among towering mountains, narrow valleys, and isolated highlands. Here, in the region known today as Luristan in western Iran, remarkable bronze creations continue to surface from the earth, long after the people who crafted them disappeared into history. Morning light spreads across steep limestone ridges, illuminating rolling hills where ancient shepherds once guided their flocks through seasonal pastures. Hidden among these mountains are thousands of ancient burials, abandoned settlements, and forgotten shrines. For centuries, the landscape concealed one of archaeology's most distinctive artistic traditions. Then, during the 20th century, extraordinary bronze objects began appearing on the international antiquities market, capturing the attention of historians, collectors, and museums around the world. These artifacts, now known collectively as the Luristan bronzes, display an astonishing level of craftsmanship. Finely cast horse bits, ceremonial axes, standards, weapons, pins, and elaborate finials feature intricate designs unlike those found elsewhere in the ancient world. Human figures merge with animals in complex compositions. Ibexes stretch into elegant curves. Mythical creatures intertwine around openwork frames, while stylized birds, lions, and horned beings seem to emerge from the metal itself. Every object suggests not only technical mastery, but also a symbolic language that remains only partly understood. Most of these bronzes date between roughly 1200 and 700 BC, although some may be older or slightly later. During this period, communities living within the Zagros Mountains occupied an important position between Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. Trade routes crossed these highlands, carrying goods, metals, livestock, and ideas between distant civilizations. Yet unlike neighboring kingdoms that left extensive written records, the people responsible for the Luristan bronzes remain largely silent in history. This absence of written testimony makes every artifact unusually important. Without royal inscriptions, historical chronicles, or monumental architecture to guide interpretation, archaeologists rely on excavation, metallurgy, burial customs, and regional comparisons. The bronzes themselves become the primary witnesses to a culture that expressed its identity through craftsmanship rather than written language. Then, quite suddenly, this distinctive artistic tradition begins to fade. By the early 1st millennium BC, the production of these characteristic bronze objects declined dramatically. The reasons remain uncertain. Did the workshops simply close? Did cultural preferences change? Or did broader political and environmental forces reshape life in ways that gradually ended a centuries-old tradition? One widely accepted explanation points toward changing technology. Iron became increasingly common across the ancient Near East during this period. Stronger and often more practical than bronze for many tools and weapons, iron transformed economies and warfare alike. As ironworking expanded, demand for elaborate bronze ceremonial objects may have diminished. Rather than a sudden collapse, the decline could represent a gradual shift toward new materials and different artistic traditions. Political change may also have played a significant role. The rise of powerful regional states, including expanding Assyrian influence and later Median authority, altered the balance of power throughout the Zagros region. Independent highland communities that once maintained local traditions may have become increasingly integrated into larger political systems. Trade networks changed. Military alliances shifted. Cultural identities slowly blended into broader regional societies. Environmental factors cannot be dismissed either. The Zagros Mountains have always presented a demanding landscape. Variations in rainfall, changing grazing conditions, earthquakes, and fluctuations in trade could all have influenced the livelihoods of pastoral communities. Small changes repeated over generations sometimes produce profound cultural transformations without leaving dramatic evidence in the archaeological record. Yet several aspects of the mystery remain difficult to explain. The symbolic imagery found on the bronzes appears remarkably consistent across hundreds of objects, suggesting shared beliefs or ceremonial practices that persisted for centuries. Then these familiar motifs become increasingly rare. Did religious traditions evolve? Were sacred rituals abandoned? Or did the meanings survive in forms that archaeologists have simply not recognized? Another challenge arises from the history of discovery itself. Many Luristan bronzes entered museum collections through unauthorized excavations during the early 20th century. Because countless objects were removed without proper archaeological documentation, valuable information about their original locations and contexts was permanently lost. A beautifully crafted artifact can reveal much about ancient technology, but without knowing precisely where it was buried or what surrounded it, important pieces of its story disappear forever. This loss of context has encouraged a range of interpretations. Some independent researchers have suggested that the bronzes represent the remains of an isolated religious tradition whose centers have yet to be identified. Others have proposed that hidden sanctuaries may still lie undiscovered within remote valleys of the Zagros, preserving clues about ceremonies, beliefs, and social organization that vanished from written history. While such ideas remain speculative, ongoing archaeological surveys continue to reveal previously unknown settlements throughout the region, reminding us that the mountains still hold many secrets. Advances in scientific analysis are gradually adding new pieces to the puzzle. Metallurgical studies can identify the sources of copper and tin used by ancient craftsmen. Isotope analysis offers clues about trade and mobility. Remote sensing technologies reveal buried structures invisible from the ground. Each new method expands our understanding while also exposing new layers of uncertainty. Perhaps the true mystery is not simply why the Luristan bronze culture declined, but how such an extraordinary artistic tradition flourished for centuries with so little written record, only to leave behind objects that continue to speak in symbols no one fully understands. Resting beneath the quiet hills of the Zagros, surrounded by stone, earth, and silence, The final chapters of this remarkable culture may still remain hidden, waiting for discoveries that could reshape everything we believe we know about its disappearance. If the bronzes of Luristan preserve the fading echoes of a people whose identity remains partly hidden, our journey now leads farther north, into a kingdom that emerged from the mountains with remarkable speed and unexpected power. Its fortresses crowned volcanic ridges, its engineers mastered difficult terrain, and its kings challenged one of the greatest empires of the ancient world. Yet despite its achievements, the true beginnings of Urartu remain wrapped in uncertainty, scattered across stone inscriptions, forgotten settlements, and legends that refuse to fade. The highlands surrounding Lake Van possess a quiet grandeur, unlike almost anywhere else in the ancient Near East. Snow-covered peaks rise above deep blue waters, while broad volcanic plains stretch toward distant horizons. Massive cliffs dominate the landscape, their surfaces carved with inscriptions left by rulers who believed their accomplishments would endure forever. Even today, the ruins of ancient fortresses seem to grow naturally from the stone itself, as though the mountains had shaped them rather than human hands. It was here, during the early 1st millennium BC, that the kingdom of Urartu emerged as one of the most formidable powers of its age. At its height, Urartu controlled vast territories across the Armenian highlands, extending influence over strategic mountain passes, fertile valleys, and important trade routes connecting Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Iranian plateau. Its rulers constructed impressive fortifications, advanced irrigation canals, temples, and administrative centers, whose remains still demonstrate remarkable engineering skill. Yet the origins of this kingdom are far less certain than its later achievements. The earliest Assyrian records mention a region called Urartu during the 13th century BC. Rather than describing a unified kingdom, these inscriptions refer to a collection of independent tribal lands scattered throughout the mountains. Over time, references begin to shift. By the 9th century BC, Assyrian texts increasingly describe a more organized political entity known as Urartu, capable of resisting military campaigns and negotiating as a regional power. How did this transformation occur? Most historians believe Urartu gradually formed through the unification of numerous highland communities that had previously maintained separate identities. Shared threats from expanding empires, combined with growing economic cooperation, may have encouraged local rulers to consolidate authority under stronger leadership. Rather than appearing suddenly, the kingdom likely evolved over generations through alliances, conflict, and political adaptation. Archaeological evidence supports parts of this picture. Excavations reveal continuity between earlier mountain settlements and later Urartian cities. Pottery styles develop gradually rather than appearing abruptly. Agricultural systems expand, while increasingly sophisticated fortifications suggest growing administrative coordination. Instead of replacing an older culture, Urartu appears to have emerged from traditions already deeply rooted within the highlands. Even so, important mysteries remain. The language of Urartu belongs to the Hurro-Urartian family, sharing connections with the earlier Hurrian language spoken across parts of the ancient Near East. Yet the precise relationship between the Hurrians and the people who eventually established Urartu continues to be debated. Were the rulers direct descendants of earlier Hurrian populations? Did several cultural groups gradually merge into a new political identity? Or does the surviving evidence reveal only part of a far more complex process? Religious traditions add another layer of intrigue. Urartian inscriptions frequently honor the god Haldi, alongside deities such as Tesheba and Shivini. Monumental temples dedicated to these gods became central features of royal cities, reflecting an organized state religion. Yet many aspects of Urartian belief appear to preserve much older mountain traditions. Sacred peaks, natural springs, and remote sanctuaries continued to hold spiritual importance, suggesting that ancient local customs survived even as royal institutions expanded. This blending of old and new has encouraged several interpretations. Some scholars view Urartu as the culmination of centuries of gradual cultural development within the Armenian highlands, shaped by indigenous communities adapting to changing political realities. Others suggest that influential groups arriving from neighboring regions may have contributed new forms of leadership, military organization, or religious practice, eventually giving rise to a unified kingdom. Beyond these mainstream explanations lie more speculative ideas. Certain independent researchers have proposed that the highlands preserved memories of civilizations reaching much further into the past than conventional chronology allows. According to these theories, Urartu inherited fragments of forgotten knowledge from earlier societies whose names no longer survive in written history. Supporters sometimes point to the kingdom's impressive stone construction, advanced hydraulic engineering, and carefully planned fortresses as evidence of traditions developed over much longer periods. Archaeology, however, has not produced conclusive evidence supporting such claims. The engineering achievements of Urartu can be understood through the steady development of local expertise combined with influences from neighboring civilizations. Even so, the remarkable sophistication of its architecture continues to inspire admiration and raises questions about how knowledge circulated across the ancient world. Adding to the mystery is the kingdom's relationship with its rivals. Assyrian inscriptions portray Urartu as both a dangerous enemy and a worthy opponent. Their repeated military campaigns reveal not only conflict, but also mutual awareness, technological exchange, and political competition. Much of what we know about Urartu comes through these encounters, meaning its history is often viewed through the perspective of those determined to defeat it. Modern excavations continue to reshape our understanding. Remote sensing, detailed surveys, and new discoveries across eastern Turkey, Armenia, and northwestern Iran reveal previously unknown settlements, roads, irrigation systems, and fortifications. Each discovery strengthens the historical picture, while also reminding researchers how much of the kingdom remains unexplored beneath villages, volcanic deposits, and mountain landscapes that have changed little for thousands of years. Perhaps that is what makes the origins of Urartu so compelling. Its rise was neither sudden nor simple, but the full story remains incomplete. Somewhere among the windswept ridges, hidden valleys, and silent stone citadels, the earliest chapters of this remarkable kingdom may still lie buried beneath the earth, waiting for the discoveries that will reveal how a collection of mountain communities became one of the ancient world's greatest powers, or whether an even older story has yet to be uncovered. If the origins of Urartu remain only partly illuminated by inscriptions and ruined fortresses, another mystery waits just beyond its ancient frontiers. There, on a broad plain surrounded by distant mountains, lies a settlement whose final moments have been preserved with extraordinary clarity. Yet despite decades of excavation, one question continues to resist a definitive answer. Who first built the powerful fortifications of Hasanlu, and what forgotten people laid the foundations beneath the city that later generations inherited? At dawn, the landscape around Hasanlu appears almost timeless. Gentle hills rise beyond fertile fields, while seasonal streams wind quietly across the plain. From a distance, the ancient mound seems little more than a natural hill, blending almost effortlessly into the surrounding countryside. Only upon closer inspection does its true nature become clear. Layer upon layer of buried architecture rests beneath the soil, each representing centuries of occupation, rebuilding, destruction, and renewal. Hasanlu stands in the Solduz Valley of northwestern Iran, a region that has long served as a meeting place between civilizations. Trade routes crossed these fertile lands, linking the Zagros Mountains with the Armenian highlands and the great kingdoms of Mesopotamia. Because of this strategic position, the settlement witnessed continual cultural exchange over many centuries. Pottery styles shifted, languages changed, political powers rose and fell. Yet the hill itself remained occupied through much of the ancient world. The site is perhaps best known for its dramatic destruction around the late 9th century BC. Excavations uncovered buildings consumed by fire, collapsed walls, and the remains of individuals caught in the final moments of an overwhelming attack. Some still held tools or weapons. Others appeared to have sought refuge within burning structures. Time seemed to stop in an instant, preserving an unusually vivid snapshot of a vanished community. Among the discoveries was the famous Hasanlu gold bowl, an exquisitely crafted vessel decorated with intricate scenes whose meanings continue to inspire debate. Mythical creatures, ritual processions, divine figures, and symbolic imagery circle its surface with remarkable precision. The bowl hints at a sophisticated culture possessing artistic traditions that remain only partly understood. Yet long before the city met its fiery end, massive defensive walls had already defined the settlement. These fortifications were not simple barriers. Thick mud brick walls, carefully planned gateways, towers, and elevated defensive positions demonstrate considerable engineering knowledge. Their construction required organized labor, skilled planning, and access to substantial resources. Such projects are rarely the work of isolated villages. They usually reflect stable leadership capable of coordinating large communities over extended periods. The question is whether the people who built these fortifications were the same people who occupied Hasanlu during its final centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests that the settlement experienced repeated phases of rebuilding across many generations. New structures often rose directly upon the remains of older ones. As a result, later inhabitants inherited architectural foundations whose original builders may already have been forgotten. Layers of history became physically intertwined, making it difficult to distinguish one cultural phase from another with complete certainty. Several theories have emerged to explain these earliest builders. Many archaeologists believe the fortifications developed gradually under local highland communities that adapted their defenses as regional competition intensified. Rather than representing a single grand construction project, the walls may reflect centuries of expansion, repair, and improvement. This interpretation fits evidence from other settlements across the ancient Near East, where fortifications often evolved alongside growing populations. Others point toward the influence of neighboring kingdoms. During different periods, the region fell within the sphere of powerful states, including Urartu and Assyria. Architectural techniques, administrative practices, and military strategies frequently spread through diplomacy, trade, and conflict. The builders of Hasanlu may therefore have combined local traditions with ideas introduced from surrounding civilizations. Even so, important uncertainties remain. No surviving inscription clearly identifies the original founders of the earliest fortifications. Unlike many royal capitals, Hasanlu has yielded relatively few written records capable of answering fundamental historical questions. Archaeologists instead rely upon pottery sequences, construction methods, radiocarbon dating, and comparative analysis to reconstruct its past. Every new excavation sharpens the picture while leaving significant gaps untouched. This absence of certainty has encouraged broader speculation. Some independent researchers have wondered whether the deepest architectural layers preserve evidence of a forgotten regional kingdom whose political identity disappeared before neighboring empires began recording local history. Others suggest that the impressive defensive system reflects an alliance of highland communities rather than centralized rule under a single monarch. While these possibilities remain unproven, they remind us that many societies flourished beyond the reach of surviving written chronicles. The destruction of Hasanlu has also fueled continuing debate. Who launched the final assault? Some historians associate the attack with the expansion of Urartu. Others consider conflicts involving Assyria or rival local powers equally plausible. The archaeological evidence clearly records violent destruction, yet assigning responsibility remains surprisingly difficult. Without contemporary written testimony from Hasanlu itself, certainty continues to remain just beyond reach. Modern scientific techniques are gradually revealing details unavailable to earlier generations of researchers. Microscopic analysis of construction materials helps identify different building phases. Environmental studies reconstruct ancient landscapes and agricultural practices. Isotopic analysis of human remains offers clues about migration, diet, and mobility. Each discovery deepens our understanding of the community while also emphasizing how many questions remain unanswered. Perhaps the greatest mystery lies beneath the lowest excavated layers, where the first builders shaped earth into walls that would protect generations they could never imagine. Their names have vanished. Their language may be lost. Yet the fortifications they raised endured through centuries of change, conflict, and renewal. Beneath the quiet mound of Hasanlu, deeper foundations may still rest untouched, preserving the forgotten story of those who transformed an ordinary hill into one of the ancient world's most enduring strongholds, and inviting us to wonder how much of that story still waits beneath the soil. If the buried walls of Hasanlu remind us that entire civilizations can remain hidden beneath layers of earth, our journey now carries us westward into the rolling highlands of ancient Anatolia. Here, another mystery rises not from forgotten fortifications, but from the silent hills themselves. Beneath these broad earthen mounds, generations of rulers were laid to rest. Yet for the earliest kings of Phrygia, their final resting places remain among the most elusive puzzles of the ancient world. Across the central Anatolian plateau, long ridges stretch toward the horizon beneath wide skies that change with every passing season. Among these landscapes stand dozens of artificial hills, known as tumuli, their gentle slopes blending almost naturally into the countryside. At first glance, they resemble ordinary rises in the land. Only careful observation reveals that each mound was deliberately constructed, covering chambers built to preserve the memory of powerful individuals whose influence once shaped an emerging kingdom. The ancient kingdom of Phrygia flourished during the early 1st millennium BC, reaching prominence after the political upheavals that followed the Bronze Age collapse. Centered around its capital at Gordian, Phrygia developed into one of Anatolia's most influential states. Its rulers controlled fertile agricultural lands, important trade routes, and expanding networks of exchange that connected the Aegean world with the interior of Asia Minor. Today, Gordian is surrounded by one of the largest concentrations of burial mounds in the ancient Near East. The most famous of these is often called the Midas Mound, an immense tumulus constructed from earth and stone that dominates the surrounding plain. Although tradition once associated it with the legendary King Midas, archaeological evidence indicates that the individual buried there was probably an earlier royal figure, possibly Midas's father or another prominent member of the Phrygian dynasty. Inside, archaeologists discovered a carefully crafted wooden burial chamber containing remarkable furniture, bronze vessels, textiles, and evidence of an elaborate funerary banquet. The discovery transformed our understanding of Phrygian society. Yet it also revealed an unexpected problem. If such an impressive tomb belonged to an earlier ruler, where were the graves of the kingdom's founding kings? Where was the burial place of Midas himself, the monarch whose name became one of antiquity's most enduring legends? Despite decades of archaeological investigation, no tomb has been conclusively identified as his. Even more intriguing, the earliest generations of Phrygian rulers remain largely absent from the archaeological record. Historians generally believe that the royal cemetery at Gordian developed gradually over time, with successive rulers choosing nearby locations for monumental burials. Many tumuli remain unexcavated, either to preserve them for future research or because excavation presents significant technical challenges. It is therefore entirely possible that undiscovered royal tombs still lie beneath untouched mounds awaiting careful investigation. However, this explanation may not account for every mystery. Several ancient burial mounds show signs of disturbance dating back thousands of years. Tomb robbery was already a serious concern in antiquity. Wealth buried alongside powerful rulers attracted attention almost immediately after construction. Precious metals, jewelry, ceremonial weapons, and luxury goods often disappeared long before modern archaeologists arrived. In some cases, only fragments of wooden chambers or scattered objects remained to indicate the original grandeur of the burial. Natural processes have also shaped the landscape. Centuries of erosion, agriculture, earthquakes, and repeated human settlement have altered the region dramatically. Smaller tumuli may have been flattened, incorporated into farmland, or concealed beneath later construction. Others could remain unrecognized, appearing no different from ordinary hills after nearly 3,000 years of gradual change. Beyond the archaeological evidence lies the enduring figure of King Midas himself. Ancient Greek tradition remembered him as the ruler whose touch transformed everything into gold, a tale blending moral reflection with legendary imagination. Historical records, however, portray a very different individual, a real Phrygian king who ruled during the late 8th century BC and maintained diplomatic contact with neighboring kingdoms, including Assyria. This combination of history and legend has often blurred the search for his actual tomb. Some researchers suggest that Midas may not have received the kind of monumental burial later generations expected. Political instability, military conflict, or changing religious traditions could have influenced royal funerary practices. If circumstances surrounding his death were unusual, his burial may have differed significantly from those of earlier rulers. Others have explored more speculative possibilities. Could the earliest Phrygian kings have been buried far from Gordion in locations that have not yet been identified? Some independent theories propose that hidden chambers remain beneath unexplored tumuli, or beneath settlements constructed centuries later. Others wonder whether certain royal burials were intentionally concealed to protect sacred objects or dynastic symbols during times of invasion. While archaeology has yet to confirm such ideas, the absence of clearly identified tombs continues to invite careful discussion. Modern technologies have expanded the search without disturbing the landscape. Ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, aerial photography, and remote sensing now allow archaeologists to detect buried structures hidden beneath layers of earth. Several promising anomalies have been identified across the Gordian landscape, suggesting that previously unknown chambers may still survive beneath untouched mounds. Every discovery raises new questions rather than closing old ones. Why do some royal burials display extraordinary wealth while others remain absent? Did changing political traditions alter how kings wished to be remembered? Or have the earliest tombs simply remained beyond the reach of excavation, patiently preserved beneath hills that generations have passed without realizing what lies below? The quiet tumuli of ancient Phrygia continue to watch over the Anatolian plain, keeping their silence as they have for nearly 3 millennia. Somewhere beneath these carefully shaped mounds, among timber chambers sealed by earth and time, the missing royal tombs may still endure, waiting for the moment when another forgotten king is finally welcomed back into history. If the royal tombs of early Phrygia remain hidden beneath the quiet hills of Anatolia, another forgotten kingdom lies farther to the southeast, where fertile plains meet the Mediterranean Sea. Here, the mystery is not the location of a burial, but the fading of an entire state that once stood at the crossroads of powerful empires. Its rulers signed treaties, built impressive cities, and controlled prosperous trade routes. Then, almost without warning, the kingdom of Kui slipped into history's shadows. The broad Cilician plain stretches between rugged mountain ranges and the shimmering coastline of the eastern Mediterranean. Rich rivers descend from the Taurus Mountains, feeding fertile farmland before emptying into the sea. For thousands of years, this landscape has served as a natural bridge between Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Levant. Merchants, soldiers, diplomats, and migrants all passed through these plains, carrying goods, languages, and ideas across continents. In antiquity, this strategic region was known as Qui. Emerging during the early 1st millennium BC, the Kingdom of Qui occupied one of the most valuable locations in the ancient Near East. Whoever controlled these fertile lands also controlled access through the mountain passes connecting inland Anatolia with the Mediterranean coast. Agriculture flourished, trade expanded, and ports along the nearby coastline linked the kingdom to distant maritime networks. Ancient inscriptions provide glimpses into a kingdom that was both prosperous and politically sophisticated. Assyrian records refer to Qui as an important regional power whose rulers alternated between cooperation and resistance as the Assyrian Empire steadily expanded westward. Local inscriptions written in Luwian hieroglyphs also preserve the names of kings who celebrated construction projects, military successes, and religious devotion. Together, these sources reveal a society that possessed its own distinct identity while navigating the pressures imposed by far larger neighbors. Yet despite these historical traces, much about Qui remains uncertain. Its cities have been identified with varying degrees of confidence, but many remain only partially excavated. Layers of later occupation often cover the ancient settlements, making it difficult to reconstruct the kingdom's earliest history or its final years. Written records survive only in fragments, forcing historians to piece together the story from scattered inscriptions, archaeological discoveries, and references preserved by rival powers. The disappearance of Qui appears closely connected to the rise of Assyria. During the 8th century BC, Assyrian kings repeatedly campaigned across the region, incorporating neighboring kingdoms into an increasingly centralized imperial administration. Historical records indicate that Qui eventually became an Assyrian province, governed by officials appointed from the imperial court. On the surface, this transition seems straightforward. Independent rule gave way to imperial control, and the kingdom ceased to exist as a separate political entity. But political conquest does not always erase a civilization overnight. What became of the people who identified themselves as citizens of Qui? Did local traditions quietly survive beneath imperial administration? Were ancient customs preserved within villages and temples long after the kingdom's name disappeared from official records? Archaeology often demonstrates that cultural identity can endure even when political boundaries change dramatically. Excavations throughout the Cilician Plain reveal both continuity and transformation. Pottery styles evolve rather than vanish abruptly. Religious sanctuaries continue to function, although they sometimes display influences from neighboring cultures. Administrative practices shift alongside changing political authority, yet everyday life often appears remarkably stable. This suggests that the disappearance of Qui may have been less a sudden collapse than a gradual absorption into broader regional systems. Even so, unanswered questions remain. Some royal inscriptions from the region contain titles and genealogies that are still debated by scholars. Were these rulers members of long-established local dynasties, or did they represent new elites who emerged after the decline of earlier Bronze Age kingdoms? The limited number of surviving texts makes it difficult to trace political succession with confidence. Language adds another layer to the mystery. The inhabitants of Qui used Luwian hieroglyphic inscriptions while interacting diplomatically with Assyria through Akkadian. Such multilingual environments often reflect complex societies where several cultural traditions coexist. Did this diversity strengthen the kingdom by encouraging exchange, or did it make political unity more difficult during periods of external pressure? The surviving evidence offers no definitive answer. Beyond mainstream historical interpretations, more speculative ideas occasionally emerge. Some independent researchers have suggested that the Kingdom of Quay inherited traditions reaching back to the Hittite world, preserving institutions that survived the collapse of Bronze Age empires. Others wonder whether important ceremonial centers remain undiscovered beneath the fertile plains, concealed by thousands of years of agriculture and continuous settlement. Because much of the region has remained occupied since antiquity, vast portions of the ancient kingdom have never been systematically explored. Modern archaeological techniques continue to reveal surprising details. Satellite imagery identifies buried settlement patterns invisible at ground level. Geophysical surveys detect structures hidden beneath cultivated fields without disturbing the soil. Careful excavation has uncovered fortifications, workshops, temples, and administrative buildings that gradually enrich the historical picture. Yet each discovery also reminds researchers how much of Quay still lies beneath modern landscapes. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not why the kingdom disappeared, but why its memory faded so completely despite its strategic importance. Neighboring empires filled monuments with accounts of victories and conquests, yet the voices of Quay itself survive only in scattered inscriptions carved into weathered stone. Somewhere beneath the fertile plains of ancient Cilicia, beneath fields that have produced harvests for countless generations, forgotten cities may still preserve the missing chapters of this kingdom's story, waiting for the moment when silence finally gives way to understanding, or perhaps to even greater mystery. As the memory of the Kingdom of Quay fades into the fertile plains of Cilicia, our attention turns further south, where the land narrows into a corridor of desert valleys, coastal ridges, and ancient caravan paths. This is the southern Levant, a region that has long served as a gateway between Africa and Asia, where civilizations met, exchanged goods, and reshaped one another through trade. Among the most important of these exchanges was copper, a metal that quietly powered the ancient world, yet whose earliest trade routes remain only partially understood. The landscape here is deceptively quiet. Sunlight moves across arid hills, limestone cliffs, and dry riverbeds that occasionally awaken with seasonal rains. From above, faint traces of ancient paths can still be seen cutting across the terrain, like forgotten veins in the earth. These were once part of a vast network of movement, connecting mining regions, desert way stations, coastal ports, and inland cities stretching across the Levant and beyond. Copper was essential in the ancient world. It was used to make tools, weapons, ceremonial objects, and later, bronze when alloyed with tin. Entire economies depended on its extraction and distribution. In the southern Levant, archaeological evidence points to early mining and smelting activities dating back to the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age periods, long before large centralized states fully emerged. Sites in the desert margins and mountainous regions preserve traces of furnaces, slag deposits, and mining debris, suggesting that local communities were deeply involved in metal production. Yet the full extent of the trade networks that carried this copper remains surprisingly elusive. Artifacts made from Levantine copper have been found far beyond the region itself, appearing in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and even distant parts of the Aegean world. Chemical and isotopic analysis has, in some cases, linked these objects back to ore sources in the southern regions. This suggests a trade system that was both extensive and highly organized, capable of moving heavy materials across long distances through challenging terrain. But who controlled these routes? Mainstream archaeological interpretations suggest a combination of local chiefdoms, emerging city-states, and later early kingdoms managing sections of the trade network. Caravans may have moved between loosely connected settlements rather than following a single unified route. Coastal ports likely played a major role, allowing copper to be shipped across the Mediterranean, while inland paths connected desert mining zones to agricultural centers. Still, the picture remains incomplete. Many of the most important mining areas show signs of sudden shifts in activity. Some sites appear to have been abandoned and later reoccupied. Others show periods of intense production followed by long gaps with little evidence of use. These fluctuations raise questions about what influenced the stability of copper trade routes over time. Was it environmental change, political instability, or shifting control by emerging regional powers? During the Late Bronze Age, the Levant was part of a complex international system involving Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia. Copper from Cypriot sources was widely traded, but the southern Levant also appears in distribution patterns, though less clearly documented. Some scholars suggest that smaller, less centralized networks may have operated alongside the major international trade systems, filling gaps in supply and demand when larger empires were weakened or distracted. Then, around the end of the 13th century BC, these systems begin to fragment. This period, often associated with the broader Bronze Age collapse, saw widespread disruption of trade across the eastern Mediterranean. Large palace economies declined, long-distance trade routes weakened, and production centers were abandoned or repurposed. Within this transformation, the copper networks of the southern Levant seem to have changed dramatically, though the exact nature of that change remains difficult to reconstruct. Did the trade routes simply dissolve, or were they redirected? Some researchers propose that surviving communities may have reorganized trade on a more localized scale, maintaining copper production but no longer exporting it as widely as before. Others suggest that knowledge of certain mining regions may have been lost or intentionally restricted, possibly due to conflict or shifting territorial control. In such scenarios, once thriving extraction zones could have fallen into obscurity, their locations remembered only in fragmented traditions or buried beneath later settlement layers. More speculative ideas occasionally emerge from the gaps in the record. Could there have been specialized groups of itinerant metal traders who moved between mining regions and coastal hubs, operating outside formal political structures? Some theories even suggest that knowledge of certain high-quality ore sources may have been deliberately concealed to protect economic advantage. While such ideas remain unproven, they reflect the enduring mystery of how ancient economies functioned beyond the reach of written documentation. Modern archaeology continues to refine our understanding through advanced analytical methods. Isotopic fingerprinting of copper artifacts now allows researchers to trace materials back to specific geological sources with increasing precision. Satellite imaging and field surveys are gradually revealing ancient mining landscapes previously hidden beneath shifting sands and modern development. Each discovery helps map fragments of a network that once stretched across continents. Yet even with these advances, large portions of the copper trade system remain uncharted. The routes themselves may not have been fixed roads in the modern sense, but flexible pathways shaped by season, politics, and survival. In a world without standardized maps, knowledge of safe passage may have been passed orally from generation to generation, making it especially vulnerable to disruption. When societies changed, that knowledge may have faded with them. Perhaps the most enduring question is not where the copper came from, but how much of this vast network has been lost entirely to time. Beneath the deserts, valleys, and coastal plains of the southern Levant, traces of forgotten paths may still exist. Routes that once carried one of humanity's most important resources across a connected ancient world, now waiting in silence beneath the shifting sands, asking whether we will ever fully reconstruct the journeys they once made possible. As the copper routes of the southern Levant fade into the desert horizon, our path turns northwest toward a very different landscape, one shaped not by open trade corridors or coastal networks, but by rugged mountains, river valleys, and isolated ridgelines overlooking the Atlantic. This is ancient Iberia, where some of the earliest fortified hilltop settlements in Western Europe began to appear, long before the rise of the well-known classical civilizations that would later define the region. At first glance, these sites are almost indistinguishable from the natural landscape. Weathered stone walls follow the contours of high hills, blending into rocky outcrops and windswept slopes. From a distance, they appear silent and unremarkable. But as one approaches, the outlines of ancient planning begin to emerge. Defensive enclosures, terraced platforms, and circular or oval structures arranged with deliberate intention. These are the earliest known hill forts of Iberia, marking a profound transformation in how communities chose to live, defend themselves, and organize space. The earliest examples date broadly to the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, around the transition between the 2nd and 1st millennia BC, though precise chronologies remain debated in different regions of the Iberian Peninsula. These settlements appear across what is now Portugal and western Spain, often situated in strategically elevated positions with wide visibility over surrounding valleys and river systems. Their placement is no accident. From these heights, inhabitants could monitor movement across the landscape, control access to fertile lowlands, and maintain defensive advantage against potential threats. Thick stone walls, sometimes reinforced with timber or earth, encircled domestic areas where dwellings, storage pits, and communal spaces were constructed. In some cases, later occupation layers reveal continuous rebuilding over centuries, suggesting long-term use and adaptation rather than short-lived occupation. Yet despite their clear defensive character, the question remains: what drove the emergence of these fortified communities? Mainstream archaeological interpretations suggest a combination of environmental, social, and political factors. The transition from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age brought significant changes across Europe. Population movements, shifting trade routes, and the introduction of new technologies all contributed to increasing regional instability. In such a context, communities may have chosen elevated, fortified positions as a practical response to uncertainty, competition, or conflict over resources. At the same time, these sites also reflect growing social complexity. The construction of hill forts required coordination, labor organization, and shared knowledge of engineering techniques. This implies not only the presence of leadership structures, but also cooperative social systems capable of sustaining long-term construction projects. Some archaeologists view these settlements as early expressions of emerging tribal or proto-urban societies, gradually evolving toward more centralized forms of organization. However, the archaeological record does not always provide a straightforward narrative. In some regions, hill forts appear suddenly, fully formed, with little evidence of earlier developmental stages. In others, they are built over earlier, less defended settlements, suggesting a gradual shift in settlement patterns. This uneven distribution has led researchers to question whether the phenomenon emerged independently in multiple regions or spread through cultural diffusion influenced by external contacts. Connections to broader Mediterranean networks remain a subject of ongoing discussion. During this period, the Western Mediterranean was not isolated. Maritime trade linked Iberia to the wider ancient world, including regions influenced by Phoenician expansion and later Mediterranean civilizations. While direct evidence of external influence in the earliest hill forts remains limited, the possibility of indirect contact through trade or migration continues to be explored. Certain artifact styles, metallurgical techniques, and ceramic traditions hint at a complex web of interaction that may not yet be fully understood. Then there is the question of abandonment and transformation. Many early hill forts show signs of gradual decline or restructuring rather than sudden destruction. Walls were rebuilt in different styles, settlement layouts shifted, and in some cases, sites were eventually abandoned in favor of more accessible valley floor settlements during later historical periods. The reasons for these changes remain varied and often difficult to isolate. Environmental shifts, Agricultural expansion, social reorganization, or changes in regional power structures may all have played a role. Still, not every aspect fits neatly into established explanations. Some hill forts contain features whose functions remain uncertain. Isolated enclosures, unusual alignments of walls, or storage structures that do not match typical domestic patterns. While most researchers interpret these within practical or symbolic frameworks, a small number of alternative theories suggest more complex ceremonial or regional roles that have yet to be fully understood. These interpretations remain speculative, but highlight how much remains uncertain about daily life within these fortified spaces. Modern archaeology continues to uncover new examples across the Iberian landscape, often revealed through aerial photography, LiDAR scanning, and systematic regional surveys. These technologies have dramatically expanded the number of known sites, suggesting that many more remain hidden beneath forested hills or agricultural land. Each discovery adds another piece to a growing puzzle, yet the overall picture remains incomplete. Perhaps the most compelling mystery is not why these hill forts were built, but how quickly they became a defining feature of the Iberian landscape during a period of transition whose causes are still only partially understood. Were they primarily defensive refuges, emerging centers of authority, or something more complex that combined social, economic, and symbolic roles? And if so much of their history is still being uncovered today, what other early settlements might remain concealed beneath the hills of Iberia, waiting quietly for the moment when the stone walls of the past begin to speak again? As the stone-built hill forts of ancient Iberia fade into memory, our journey turns eastward once again, crossing mountains, seas, and cultural frontiers to a land where myth and history have long been intertwined. Here, along the mist-shrouded eastern shores of the Black Sea, dense forests descend toward river valleys that cut through steep Caucasian slopes. It is a landscape of shifting fog, heavy rainfall, and deep green silence, an environment that both protected and isolated the early communities who once lived here. In this setting emerges one of antiquity's most intriguing and least understood early kingdoms, Colchis. The name Colchis survives in ancient Greek literature, most famously in the myth of Jason and the Argonauts and the quest for the Golden Fleece. To later storytellers, it became a distant, almost legendary land at the edge of the known world. Yet behind the mythic imagery lies a real historical region, located in what is now western Georgia, where archaeological evidence confirms the existence of complex societies long before classical antiquity fully unfolded. The terrain itself offers important clues. Colchis is defined by its extraordinary natural conditions. Unlike the arid landscapes of neighboring regions, this coastal zone receives abundant rainfall, producing dense forests, fertile lowlands, and navigable river systems that flow toward the Black Sea. Such conditions made it one of the earliest areas in the Caucasus capable of sustaining relatively dense populations and agricultural surplus. Archaeological finds suggest that human settlement here dates back deep into the Bronze Age, with increasing complexity emerging over time. By the late 2nd millennium BC, evidence points to organized communities engaged in agriculture, metallurgy, and regional exchange. Copper and iron deposits in the nearby mountains provided valuable resources, while river valleys enabled movement between inland settlements and coastal points of contact. Over time, these interconnected communities appear to have formed the basis of what later Greek writers referred to as the Kingdom of Colchis. But how did this transformation occur? Unlike the well-documented empires of Mesopotamia or Egypt, Colchis left behind no extensive written records from its earliest phases. Its history must be reconstructed through burial sites, settlement remains, metalwork, pottery traditions, and scattered references from external civilizations. Greek authors described Colchis as wealthy and technologically advanced, particularly in metallurgy and textile production. They spoke of skilled craftsmen, complex rituals, and a land rich in resources. Yet their accounts are filtered through distance, trade contact, and mythological imagination. Archaeology confirms at least part of this picture. Excavations across western Georgia have uncovered burial mounds, fortified settlements, and advanced bronze and iron artifacts dating to the Late Bronze and Early Iron Age. Distinctive local styles suggest a cultural identity that developed gradually within the region rather than arriving fully formed from outside influence. At the same time, material connections with Anatolia, the broader Caucasus, and the Aegean world indicate active participation in wider exchange networks. Still, significant questions remain. Was Colchis a unified kingdom from its earliest emergence, or did it begin as a network of independent chiefdoms that gradually coalesced into a more centralized political structure? Some scholars suggest that its early organization may have been seasonal or ritual in nature, with authority shifting between local centers depending on agricultural cycles or trade conditions. Others argue for a more structured hierarchy, possibly influenced by contact with neighboring kingdoms that already practiced centralized rule. The role of metallurgy adds another layer of intrigue. Colchis has long been associated with advanced metalworking traditions. Archaeological evidence supports the presence of skilled bronze and iron production, yet the organization of these industries remains only partially understood. Were these technologies controlled by elite groups, religious institutions, or distributed among specialized craft communities? The absence of written administrative records makes it difficult to reconstruct how such knowledge was managed and transmitted. Then there is the enduring shadow of myth. Greek narratives placed Colchis at the edge of the world, a land of mystery, magic, and transformation. The story of the Golden Fleece, while mythological, may preserve distant echoes of real economic activities, particularly textile production and the symbolic value of wealth derived from natural resources. But separating cultural memory from historical reality is never straightforward. Myths often preserve fragments of truth while reshaping them into narrative form. Some researchers have explored more speculative interpretations. Could Colchis have served as a cultural bridge between early Caucasian societies and the wider ancient world, transmitting technologies, artistic traditions, or metallurgical techniques across regions? Others have wondered whether its early political formation may have been more fluid than traditional models suggest, with shifting alliances and seasonal centers of power, rather than a fixed capital or stable dynasty. While these ideas remain unproven, they reflect the complexity of reconstructing a history that exists primarily in fragments. Modern archaeology continues to reshape what we know. Excavations across western Georgia are revealing increasingly sophisticated settlement patterns, trade connections, and burial practices. Advances in archaeometallurgy and landscape archaeology are helping reconstruct ancient production systems and environmental conditions. Yet despite these efforts, the earliest stages of Colchis remain only partially visible. Perhaps the most enduring mystery is not whether Colchis existed, it clearly did, but how it first came into being along these river-laced, forested shores, and how much of its early development still lies hidden beneath soil, water, and time. Somewhere in the misty valleys and coastal plains of the Black Sea, the origins of this ancient kingdom may still be waiting, quietly preserved in landscapes that have changed little in appearance, but hold far more history than we can yet fully see. As the misty valleys of ancient Colchis fade into the distance, our path shifts once again toward the arid frontier landscapes of northern Mesopotamia and the upper reaches of the Euphrates basin. Here, limestone cliffs rise above dry plains, and wind-carved ridges hold the remnants of once powerful cities that guarded the edges of empires. Among these silent ruins lies a set of stone carvings whose purpose continues to provoke careful debate: the Arslan Tash reliefs. Arslan Tash, meaning lion stone in modern Turkish, is a site marked by fragments of Assyrian architecture and sculpted limestone slabs discovered in the early 20th century. These reliefs, now preserved in museum collections, once formed part of a building believed to date to the Neo-Assyrian period, around the 9th to 7th century BC. At first glance, they appear consistent with the visual language of Assyrian royal art: controlled lines, ritual scenes, protective figures, and inscriptions that speak of power and divine authority. Yet the closer one examines them, the more questions begin to emerge. The reliefs depict winged figures, stylized animals, and symbolic motifs arranged with deliberate precision. Some scenes appear to show protective spirits guarding thresholds or gateways, a common theme in Assyrian art. In this interpretation, the carvings functioned as part of an architectural program designed to protect buildings, reinforce royal authority, and demonstrate the favor of the gods. Such imagery would have been familiar in temples, palaces, and administrative centers across the Neo-Assyrian Empire. But Arslan Tash also contains elements that resist simple categorization. Among the inscriptions discovered at the site are texts written in Aramaic, including incantation-like passages that refer to protective forces and supernatural beings. These texts, unlike formal royal inscriptions, seem to reflect more personal or ritual concerns. They speak of warding off evil, guarding doorways, and invoking unseen powers. This combination of imperial artistic style and localized magical tradition raises an important question. Was Arslan Tash purely an administrative or ceremonial structure, or did it serve a more complex, layered purpose? Mainstream archaeological interpretation suggests that the site functioned as a fortified residence or administrative building within the Assyrian provincial system. In this view, the reliefs and inscriptions worked together to express both political authority and religious protection. The Assyrian Empire, known for its integration of ideology and governance, often combined state power with spiritual symbolism, making such structures both functional and ideological spaces. However, not every feature fits neatly within this framework. Some scholars have noted that the protective imagery at Arslan Tash appears unusually concentrated, as though the building was designed with an especially strong emphasis on warding off unseen threats. The presence of incantation-style texts alongside formal Assyrian artistic motifs has led to interpretations suggesting that the structure may have served dual purposes: official administration on one hand and specialized ritual practice on the other. What kind of threats required such elaborate protection? In ancient Mesopotamian belief systems, unseen forces were often considered as real and influential as political enemies. Illness, misfortune, and instability could all be interpreted through a spiritual lens. Buildings could be ritually safeguarded, and inscriptions could serve as barriers against supernatural intrusion. In this context, Arslan Tash may reflect a worldview in which governance, religion, and protective magic were deeply intertwined rather than separate domains. Beyond these mainstream interpretations, more speculative ideas have occasionally been proposed. Some independent researchers have suggested that sites like Arslan Tash may have functioned as specialized ritual centers rather than ordinary administrative buildings, possibly dedicated to boundary protection between regions or trade routes. Others have wondered whether certain symbols found in the reliefs preserve older regional traditions that predate full Assyrian control, incorporated into imperial art rather than replaced by it. While these ideas remain outside mainstream consensus, they highlight the cultural layering often present in frontier regions of expanding empires. There is also the broader question of cultural transmission. The Assyrian Empire did not exist in isolation. It absorbed, adapted, and reinterpreted artistic and religious traditions from neighboring cultures across Anatolia, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. Arslan Tash sits within this intersection of influence, where local beliefs and imperial ideology may have merged in ways that are difficult to separate today. Could some of its imagery reflect older protective traditions that were already present in the region before Assyrian expansion? Or does it represent a purely Assyrian reinterpretation of universal symbolic themes? Modern archaeology continues to analyze the site through architectural reconstruction, epigraphic study, and comparative iconography. Each method brings new clarity, yet also reveals additional layers of complexity. The fragmentary nature of the reliefs means that interpretation often depends on partial evidence, leaving room for multiple readings of the same imagery. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Arslan Tash is not what it clearly shows, but what it suggests without fully revealing. It stands at the edge of empire, where political authority meets local tradition, and where official inscriptions coexist with more intimate expressions of belief. Somewhere within its carved stone figures and protective texts lies a deeper purpose that may never be fully recovered. An ancient attempt to control forces seen and unseen, still waiting beneath the dust of centuries for its true meaning to be understood. As the carved reliefs of Arslan Tash fade into the wider landscape of the Neo-Assyrian frontier, our attention shifts slightly northward into the rugged foothills of the Taurus Mountains. Here, where stone ridges rise above narrow valleys and ancient trade routes once threaded through difficult terrain, lie the remains of a city that once stood at the meeting point of empires and cultures. Its walls are still visible today, its inscriptions still legible in places, yet its identity seems to dissolve into uncertainty as soon as one tries to follow its final chapter. This is Sam-al. Modern-day Zincirli Hoyuk in southeastern Turkey preserves the layered ruins of Sam-al, once a prominent city-state during the Iron Age. Surrounded by massive stone fortifications, the site reveals a carefully planned urban center. Gateways aligned with defensive towers, streets organized within fortified enclosures, and monumental buildings that suggest both administrative authority and royal presence. From its earliest phases, Sam-al appears to have been a place of strategic importance, controlling routes between Anatolia, the Levant, and northern Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence indicates that the city flourished particularly during the first millennium BC, when it became part of the complex political landscape shaped by the expansion of the Neo-Hittite kingdoms and later the growing influence of Assyria. Inscriptions discovered at the site, written in Luwian hieroglyphs and Aramaic, mention local rulers who governed Sam-al with a combination of regional tradition and external diplomatic engagement. Yet despite this apparent continuity, the final fate of Sam-al remains strangely difficult to reconstruct. Historical records suggest that the city eventually came under Assyrian control during the campaigns of the 9th and 8th centuries BC. Like many other Neo-Hittite centers, it was integrated into the imperial system, its rulers either replaced or transformed into provincial governors. Inscriptions from Assyrian sources describe administrative restructuring, tribute collection, and the incorporation of local elites into the broader imperial framework. On the surface, this appears to be a familiar pattern. A regional kingdom absorbed into a growing empire, its autonomy gradually reduced until it becomes one of many provincial centers within a vast political system. But when archaeologists examine the material record more closely, certain questions begin to emerge. Excavations at Zincirli reveal a city that continued to function, rebuild, and evolve even after Assyrian influence became dominant. Monumental architecture shows phases of renovation rather than sudden destruction. Imported goods appear alongside local traditions, suggesting ongoing participation in trade networks. In many respects, daily life in Sam-al seems to have continued with a degree of stability that contrasts with the abrupt tone of some historical accounts. So when did Sam-al truly disappear? Unlike cities destroyed in dramatic conquest or abandoned after environmental catastrophe, Sam-al does not present a clear moment of final collapse. Instead, it appears to fade gradually from independent historical prominence. Assyrian records eventually cease to mention it as a distinct political entity, but the settlement itself persists in archaeological layers. This creates a subtle but important distinction between political disappearance and physical abandonment. The absence of a clear endpoint has led to multiple interpretations. Mainstream archaeology generally suggests that Sam'al was absorbed into the Assyrian provincial system and later continued under successive empires, gradually losing its identity as a self-governing city-state. Over time, administrative changes, population shifts, and cultural integration may have transformed it into a regional center without distinct political autonomy. However, this explanation leaves room for deeper questions. What happens to a city's identity when its rulers disappear from the historical record? Do its inhabitants continue to recognize themselves as part of an older tradition? Or does that identity slowly dissolve as new administrative systems take hold? Archaeology can trace buildings and artifacts, but it struggles to capture the shifting sense of belonging that defines a community over generations. Some researchers have suggested that Sam'al may have retained local cultural elements longer than official records imply. The coexistence of Luwian, Aramaic, and Assyrian influences suggests a society where multiple identities overlapped rather than replaced one another. In such environments, the disappearance of a kingdom may be less a single event and more a gradual blending into larger regional structures. There are also more speculative interpretations. Certain independent theories propose that smaller Neo-Hittite cities like Sam'al may have preserved older political traditions beneath imperial administration, maintaining local governance in limited or informal ways even after incorporation into larger empires. Others suggest that later occupation layers may obscure earlier phases of the city's final transformation, leaving gaps in our understanding of how its identity evolved. Yet archaeology itself continues to refine the picture. Stratigraphic analysis, architectural sequencing, and inscriptional studies all contribute to a more nuanced understanding of continuity and change at the site. Each excavation reveals both stability and transformation, suggesting that Sam'al's disappearance may not be a single moment, but a prolonged transition shaped by shifting power dynamics. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Sam'al is not that it was lost, but that it was never fully erased. Its walls still stand. Its inscriptions still speak in fragments. Its streets still preserve traces of movement, trade, and daily life across centuries of change. Somewhere between empire and locality, between record and silence, the identity of Sam'al dissolved not into destruction, but into history itself, leaving us to wonder how many other cities may have followed the same quiet path, vanishing not with collapse, but with time. As the layered streets of Sam'al fade into the memory of shifting empires, our path continues southward along the Orontes River Valley, where fertile plains meet rising hills and ancient waterways carve through the landscape of the Levant. Here, near the modern borderlands of western Syria, lies a mound that appears unremarkable at first glance. Just another rise in the earth shaped by centuries of wind and sediment. Yet beneath this quiet surface rests Tel Qarqur, a site whose Iron Age settlement carries one of the most puzzling stories of sudden abandonment in the ancient Near East. The Tel itself rises gently above the surrounding valley, overlooking agricultural fields that have been cultivated for millennia. From this vantage point, the site once controlled access to important north-south and east-west routes, linking inland regions with coastal cities and highland communities. Such a position would have made Tel Qarqur a valuable settlement in antiquity, both strategically and economically. Archaeological excavations reveal a long sequence of occupation layers, stretching back into earlier Bronze Age periods and continuing into the Iron Age. During the Iron Age, particularly in the early 1st millennium BC, the settlement appears to have developed fortifications, domestic structures, storage facilities, and public buildings. The material record suggests a functioning community engaged in agriculture, trade, and regional interaction. Pottery fragments, architectural remains, and everyday objects paint a picture of ordinary life. Storage jars for grain, cooking vessels, tools for farming and weaving, and remnants of defensive walls that suggest concern for protection in a region often shaped by shifting political boundaries. At its peak, Tel Qarqur was not an isolated village, but part of a broader network of settlements that connected the Levant with surrounding regions. And yet, something unusual occurs in the archaeological sequence. At a certain point in the Iron Age layers, particularly during the early 1st millennium BC, the evidence of continuous occupation appears to diminish sharply. Domestic structures show signs of disruption. Some areas reveal burning, while others show abrupt cessation of activity. Storage spaces that once held agricultural surplus are left unused. In later layers, there is a noticeable absence of rebuilding in certain parts of the site. The question is not simply that the settlement changed, but how quickly and decisively parts of it seem to have been abandoned. Mainstream archaeological interpretations often link such disruptions to broader regional events. The Iron Age Levant was a landscape shaped by shifting imperial pressures, including the expansion of Assyrian power into surrounding territories. Military campaigns, changing administrative systems, and economic restructuring frequently led to the reorganization, or abandonment, of smaller settlements. Environmental factors may also have played a role, including fluctuations in rainfall patterns and agricultural productivity. In this context, Tel Qarqur's abandonment could represent a combination of political and environmental stress rather than a single catastrophic event. However, the archaeological record does not always present a fully consistent narrative. Some excavation layers suggest partial continuity even after disruption phases. Certain architectural elements appear to have been reused or modified rather than completely destroyed. In some areas, occupation seems to resume briefly before diminishing again. This uneven pattern raises questions about whether abandonment was truly final or whether the site experienced cycles of temporary desertion and reoccupation. What forces could produce such irregular patterns? One possibility is population movement rather than total destruction. Communities may have relocated to nearby sites in response to shifting political authority, economic opportunity, or environmental stress, leaving Tel Qarqur partially empty while still maintaining regional presence. In such cases, abandonment becomes less a disappearance and more a redistribution of settlement. Another interpretation considers the role of changing administrative systems. As larger empires expanded into the region, smaller settlements were sometimes absorbed into broader networks of control. Administrative centers could shift location, reducing the importance of certain sites without eliminating their populations entirely. Over time, the focus of settlement might move to more strategically advantageous or economically integrated locations. Yet there remain aspects that resist simple explanation. The apparent discontinuity in certain occupation layers suggests moments of sudden disruption that are difficult to fully reconcile with gradual transition models. Was there an external event that temporarily destabilized the region? Or do the archaeological gaps reflect preservation biases, excavation limits, or the uneven survival of material evidence? Some more speculative interpretations have also been considered in broader discussions of ancient settlement patterns. Could Tel Qarqur have experienced episodic abandonment tied to localized conflict or short-term crises that left limited traces in the archaeological record? Might environmental micro-changes in the valley have affected agricultural viability more sharply than regional models suggest? While such ideas remain unproven, they highlight how localized histories can diverge from broader regional narratives. Modern archaeological techniques continue to refine the picture. Stratigraphic analysis, radiocarbon dating, and geoarchaeological studies help reconstruct settlement phases with increasing precision. Environmental sampling reveals changes in soil composition and agricultural activity over time, offering clues about how people interacted with their landscape. Yet even with these advances, the exact sequence of abandonment and reoccupation at Tel Qarqur remains only partially understood. Perhaps the most enduring question is not whether the settlement was abandoned, but what that abandonment truly meant for the people who once lived there. Did they leave suddenly under pressure, or gradually drift away as circumstances changed? Did they return later under different conditions, or did the site simply fade from active memory as nearby communities grew? Somewhere beneath the quiet surface of the Tell, layers of earth still preserve traces of those final moments that may have unfolded slowly or all at once, leaving behind only fragments of a community whose departure continues to resist a single definitive explanation, inviting us instead to consider how often history is shaped not by dramatic endings, but by quiet and uncertain departures into time. As the quiet mound of Tel Qarqur recedes into the layered landscape of the Orontes Valley, our path continues deeper into northern Syria, where rolling plains stretch toward distant mountain ranges and ancient river systems carve through the earth with patient persistence. In this region, where settlement has never truly ceased for thousands of years, the remains of once powerful kingdoms lie buried beneath fields, villages, and shifting soil. Among them is a name preserved in Assyrian records, but largely absent from monumental visibility today: Bit Agusi. Unlike empires that rose with grand capitals and monumental architecture, Bit Agusi emerges in history more subtly, through inscriptions, administrative records, and references in the writings of its more powerful neighbors. Centered around the city of Arpad, modern Tel Rifat near Aleppo, this Aramaean kingdom flourished during the early 1st millennium BC, a time when smaller regional states occupied the space between expanding empires. The landscape of Bit Agusi would have been one of fertile plains, agricultural settlements, and interconnected towns linked by trade routes and seasonal movement. From here, routes extended toward the Euphrates, the Mediterranean coast, and inland Mesopotamia. Its position made it both strategically important and perpetually vulnerable, caught between larger political forces shaping the ancient Near East. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that Bit Agusi developed as part of the broader Aramaean cultural expansion during the Iron Age. Unlike earlier Bronze Age palace systems, Aramaean kingdoms often appear more decentralized, with power distributed among regional rulers and urban centers rather than concentrated in a single dominant capital. Arpad, however, seems to have functioned as a significant political and administrative hub within this network. Assyrian inscriptions provide some of the clearest external references to Bit Agusi. These records describe military campaigns, tribute collections, and periods of resistance followed by incorporation into the Assyrian imperial system. At its height, Bit Agusi appears to have been a recognized regional power, capable of diplomatic engagement and, at times, coordinated opposition to Assyrian expansion. Yet despite these references, the internal voice of Bit Agusi remains faint. No extensive royal archives have been recovered from Arpad. No long narrative inscriptions survive to tell its history from within. Instead, its story is reconstructed primarily through the records of Assyria, documents shaped by imperial perspective, political motivation, and the desire to record conquest and control. Then, during the mid-8th century BC, a decisive moment appears in the historical record. Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III launched a series of campaigns across the Levant and northern Syria. Among the cities mentioned in these records is Arpad, which is described as resisting Assyrian expansion for several years before eventually falling after a prolonged siege. The Assyrian accounts portray the city's capture as a significant military achievement, marking the end of local resistance in the region. After this point, Bit Agusi disappears from independent historical mention. But disappearance in historical texts does not always mean immediate erasure in lived reality. What happened to the population of Arpad after its conquest? Did the city continue to function under Assyrian administration, its identity gradually absorbed into imperial structures? Or did significant portions of its population relocate, carrying cultural traditions into surrounding regions? Archaeology suggests that urban life in the region did not cease entirely, but rather transformed under new political conditions. Excavations at Tel Rifa'at and nearby sites reveal continued occupation layers that extend beyond the Assyrian conquest period. Domestic structures, pottery sequences, and material culture indicate ongoing settlement activity, though often reflecting changes in administrative organization and external influence. This suggests a shift rather than a complete disappearance. Still, the question remains: when does a kingdom stop being itself? Mainstream interpretations view Bit Agusi as one of many Aramaean states gradually incorporated into the Assyrian Empire, losing political independence while contributing to the cultural and administrative diversity of the imperial system. In this view, its disappearance is not abrupt but incremental, marked by the slow absorption of local governance into a larger structure. However, some aspects remain open to interpretation. The absence of detailed internal records leaves gaps in understanding how local identity evolved under imperial rule. Did cultural traditions persist in rural communities even after political structures were dismantled? Were older administrative systems retained informally beneath Assyrian governance? Archaeology can trace material continuity, but it is less able to capture shifts in identity, memory, and collective self-perception. More speculative interpretations occasionally explore these gaps. Some researchers suggest that smaller kingdoms like Bit Agusi may have preserved regional autonomy in subtle ways even after formal conquest, maintaining local leadership structures under imperial oversight. Others propose that cultural memory of these kingdoms may have persisted long after their political identities disappeared, embedded in oral traditions or local place names that survived beyond written history. While such ideas remain unverified, they reflect the complexity of cultural continuity in ancient frontier regions. Modern archaeological work continues to refine the picture. Survey archaeology across northern Syria has identified settlement patterns that suggest long-term occupation continuity despite political change. Yet political history, as recorded in inscriptions, often moves faster than lived reality on the ground. This gap between administrative record and everyday life remains one of the key challenges in reconstructing Bit Agusi's final centuries. Perhaps the most compelling mystery is not how Bit Agusi fell, but how quietly it faded from independent existence while its people, landscapes, and settlements likely continued in altered form. Somewhere beneath the plains around Arpad, beneath centuries of uninterrupted habitation, traces of its earliest identity may still survive, waiting not for rediscovery in conquest or destruction, but in the slow accumulation of evidence that reveals how kingdoms do not always end, but sometimes simply dissolve into the larger patterns of history, leaving behind only questions where clear boundaries once stood. As the memory of Bit Agusi fades into the layered soil of northern Syria, our journey turns westward across the Mediterranean, where the landscape changes from open plains and river valleys to a coastline of rolling hills, volcanic ridges, and ancient harbors. Here, between sea and mountain, another civilization begins to take shape in the historical record, one that appears fully formed in some respects, yet strangely silent about its own origins. This is the world of the early Etruscans. In central Italy, the land of Etruria unfolds in soft contrasts. Cypress-lined ridges rise above fertile valleys, while mist gathers in the early morning over river basins that once supported dense networks of settlements. Ancient tombs are carved into rocky hillsides, their entrances opening into carefully constructed chambers that have preserved the material memory of a people whose cultural identity would deeply influence later Rome. Yet despite their architectural and artistic sophistication, the earliest phases of Etruscan civilization remain difficult to trace with certainty. By the early 1st millennium BC, Etruscan culture had already begun to take recognizable form. Cities such as Tarquinia, Veii, and Cerveteri reveal organized urban planning, complex religious systems, and a distinctive artistic tradition. Their tombs, often richly furnished, suggest societies with structured social hierarchies and a strong emphasis on ritual and the afterlife. Inscriptions written in the Etruscan language appear across the region, preserving a script that is still only partially understood today. And yet, the question that continues to linger is not what the Etruscans became, but how they first emerged. Unlike neighboring civilizations that gradually evolved from clearly identifiable earlier cultures, the Etruscans appear in the archaeological record with an unusual degree of cultural coherence. This has led to long-standing debates among historians and archaeologists. One widely supported interpretation suggests that Etruscan civilization developed locally from earlier Iron Age communities, known as the Villanovan culture, which itself emerged in the same region during the early 1st millennium BC. Over time, these communities appear to have grown in complexity, adopting new technologies, expanding trade networks, and developing increasingly sophisticated social structures. Archaeological evidence supports this gradual transformation. Burial practices shift from simpler cremation urns in the Villanovan phase to more elaborate chamber tombs in the Etruscan period. Metalworking becomes more refined. Trade expands across the Mediterranean, linking Etruria with Greece, Phoenician settlements, and other emerging cultural centers. These patterns suggest continuity rather than sudden arrival. Yet continuity does not fully answer the deeper question of identity. The Etruscan language remains a major point of intrigue. Unlike Indo-European languages spoken by neighboring Italic populations, Etruscan appears linguistically distinct, with limited connections to known language families. While it can be read thanks to bilingual inscriptions and transliterated texts, its full meaning remains partially elusive. This linguistic uniqueness has fueled centuries of speculation about the origins of the people who spoke it. Ancient authors themselves offered competing explanations. Some Greek historians suggested that the Etruscans may have migrated from regions across the eastern Mediterranean, while others proposed indigenous origins within Italy. These differing accounts reflect the uncertainty already present in antiquity, where cultural memory and historical reconstruction were often intertwined. Modern scholarship generally leans toward an indigenous development model, supported by archaeological continuity. However, certain unresolved aspects continue to invite broader questions. Why does Etruscan culture appear so distinctive compared to neighboring Italic societies? How did its religious systems, artistic conventions, and urban planning develop such a coherent identity within a relatively short historical timeframe? Some researchers have explored more speculative possibilities. Could the Etruscans represent a fusion of multiple cultural influences arriving through maritime trade networks across the Mediterranean? Central Italy was not isolated. It was part of an active exchange system involving Greece, the Levant, and North Africa. It is possible that ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions converged in Etruria in ways that produced a uniquely integrated cultural identity. While this does not imply external origin in a literal sense, it suggests a more complex process of cultural formation than simple linear development. Others have wondered whether early Etruscan society preserved traces of even older, pre-Iron Age traditions that have not yet been fully identified in the archaeological record. Gaps in early settlement data leave room for interpretations that are still being explored, particularly in regions where excavation is limited or stratigraphy is difficult to reconstruct. What remains particularly striking is the speed with which Etruscan civilization becomes visible in the historical record. By the 7th and 6th centuries BC, Etruria is already a network of thriving city-states with monumental architecture, organized religion, and extensive trade connections. Whether this reflects rapid internal development or a longer, less visible formative period is still a matter of ongoing investigation. Modern archaeological methods continue to refine this picture. Excavations of burial sites, settlement layers, and production centers reveal increasing complexity in social organization. Scientific analyses of materials trace trade routes that connect Etruria to the wider Mediterranean world. Yet even with these advances, the earliest emergence of Etruscan identity remains partially obscured, as if the foundation of this civilization lies just beyond the reach of surviving evidence. Perhaps the most enduring question is not whether the Etruscans had origins, but how those origins transformed into one of the most influential cultures of pre-Roman Italy without leaving a clear narrative of its earliest formation. Somewhere beneath the hills of Etruria, within layers of soil and stone that still have not been fully uncovered, the earliest steps of this civilization may still be waiting, quietly preserving the moment when scattered communities first began to recognize themselves as something more than the sum of their parts, and leaving us to wonder how often history begins long before it can be clearly seen. As the early formation of Etruscan civilization fades into the layered archaeology of central Italy, our journey shifts once more across continents and climates, leaving behind the humid valleys of the Mediterranean and moving into a very different world. Here, the landscape opens into vast desert plateaus, where silence stretches across stone basins and ancient caravan routes once connected distant oases. In this harsh environment, survival depended entirely on water, timing, and knowledge of fragile ecological balance. It is here that the ancient settlement of Tayma reveals one of its most unsettling archaeological questions. Why did its earliest flourishing give way to apparent cycles of decline and desertification? Tayma lies in the northwestern Arabian Peninsula, within a region where rocky desert plains meet isolated pockets of life-sustaining groundwater. Even today, the oasis stands out sharply against the surrounding arid landscape. Palm groves cluster around wells and depressions in the earth, while the remains of ancient walls, inscriptions, and settlement layers lie buried beneath centuries of shifting sand. To stand here is to sense both abundance and fragility at once, an environment that can sustain life, but only under precise and delicate conditions. Archaeological evidence shows that Tayma has been inhabited for thousands of years, with settlement layers dating back into the Bronze Age. Early communities appear to have established themselves around reliable water sources, developing agricultural systems that allowed the oasis to support a growing population. Over time, Tayma became more than a local settlement. Its position along long-distance trade routes linking Arabia, the Levant, and Mesopotamia transformed it into a strategic hub for caravans transporting incense, spices, metals, and luxury goods. Inscriptions discovered at the site, written in Aramaic and other ancient scripts, indicate that Tayma was later influenced by major regional powers. Assyrian records refer to the oasis as a significant point within their broader imperial network, while later Babylonian sources also acknowledge its importance. These references suggest a settlement deeply integrated into the political and economic systems of the ancient Near East. Yet beneath this narrative of connectivity lies a more uncertain pattern. Archaeological layers from the earliest phases of occupation show signs of environmental stress and changing settlement intensity. Some areas appear to have been abandoned and later reoccupied. Others show shifts in building density, suggesting that population levels may have fluctuated significantly over time. In certain strata, there is evidence of reduced agricultural activity, as if cultivation became increasingly difficult or less sustainable for extended periods. What caused these changes? Mainstream archaeological interpretations often point to a combination of environmental and climatic factors. The Arabian Peninsula has experienced long-term fluctuations in rainfall patterns over millennia. Even small reductions in precipitation can have profound effects on oasis systems, where groundwater recharge is slow and vulnerable to overuse. A slight imbalance between consumption and replenishment could gradually transform fertile zones into more arid conditions, forcing populations to adapt, relocate, or reduce settlement density. At the same time, human activity cannot be separated from environmental change. As Tayma became a node in long-distance trade networks, its population likely increased during periods of economic prosperity. Caravan traffic, agricultural expansion, and urban development would have placed additional demands on limited water resources. In such a system, sustainability depends on careful management. Even minor disruptions, whether environmental, political, or economic, could have long-term consequences for the stability of the oasis. But the archaeological record does not always present a simple cause and effect relationship. Some settlement phases appear to end abruptly rather than gradually declining. In certain areas, building activity ceases without clear evidence of destruction, leaving behind structures that seem to have been abandoned while still functional. This has led researchers to consider whether social or political changes may have played a role alongside environmental pressures. Could shifts in trade routes have reduced Tayma's importance, leading populations to relocate toward more economically active regions? Or might internal social changes, such as the restructuring of leadership or resource distribution, have influenced settlement stability in ways that are not easily visible in the material record? More speculative interpretations occasionally emerge from these gaps. Some independent researchers have suggested that ancient oasis systems like Tayma may have been far more sensitive to long-term climatic cycles than previously understood, with subtle environmental shifts producing cascading effects over generations. Others have proposed that knowledge of water management, once crucial to sustaining such settlements, may have been lost or fragmented during periods of political transition, making recovery of earlier agricultural stability more difficult. There are also broader questions about how ancient communities understood and responded to environmental change. Did the inhabitants of Tayma perceive these shifts as gradual ecological processes, or as sudden disruptions in a world where water was deeply intertwined with social and spiritual meaning? Archaeology can trace patterns of occupation, but it cannot fully recover how those patterns were experienced. Modern research continues to refine the picture through sediment analysis, paleo-environmental reconstruction, and remote sensing of buried water systems. These methods are gradually revealing how groundwater levels, climate variability, and human activity interacted over long periods. Yet even with these advances, the earliest phases of Tayma's environmental transformation remain only partially understood. Perhaps the most enduring question is not why Tayma endured in such a harsh environment for so long, but how many times it came close to collapse before recovering again, and what finally determined the limits of its resilience. Beneath the sands that surround the oasis today, traces of earlier water channels, abandoned fields, and forgotten dwellings may still lie preserved, quietly preserving the memory of a landscape that once supported life more abundantly than it does now, and leaving open the question of how many ancient communities vanished not in a single moment, but in the slow retreat of water from the land that once sustained them. As the quiet oases of Tayma fade into the desert horizon, our path turns northward once again, following the arc of ancient river valleys and fertile corridors that once sustained some of the earliest urban cultures of the Levant. Here, where the Orontes River cuts through modern Syria, the land opens into a broad basin framed by hills and volcanic plateaus. It is a landscape that has witnessed continuous human presence for millennia. Yet beneath its surface lie traces of political beginnings that are only partially understood. Among these early formations stands the kingdom of Hamath. The modern city of Hama rises along the Orontes, where the river bends gently through cultivated fields and ancient irrigation systems. But beneath this contemporary setting lies a deeper historical layer, one shaped by one of the most important early Iron Age polities in the region. Hamath appears in ancient inscriptions as a significant Aramaean kingdom, centered on a city that controlled agricultural lands, trade routes, and riverine access deep into the Syrian interior. Archaeological evidence and textual sources suggest that Hamath's earliest dynastic phases emerged during the early 1st millennium BC, a time when regional powers were forming in the vacuum left by the decline of late Bronze Age political systems. In this transitional landscape, smaller city-states and emerging kingdoms began to define new boundaries of authority, culture, and identity. Hamath was among the most prominent of these early formations. Its strategic position along the Orontes allowed it to control both agricultural production and long-distance communication routes. Fertile plains supported grain cultivation, while river pathways connected inland regions with northern Syria and the Mediterranean world. Over time, Hamath developed into a significant urban center, with fortifications, administrative structures, and religious institutions that reflected increasing political complexity. Yet, despite its importance, the earliest dynastic phases of Hamath remain surprisingly obscure. Unlike later periods where Assyrian inscriptions provide clearer references, the formative stages of Hamath's political development are only partially visible. Archaeological layers from early Iron Age contexts reveal settlement continuity, but the identities of the ruling structures during these earliest phases are not always clearly defined. This creates a historical gap between the emergence of urban occupation and the appearance of fully documented kingship. What kind of political system existed in Hamath before it appears in written records? Mainstream interpretations suggest that Hamath developed gradually from a regional center into a structured kingdom, with early dynasties likely emerging from local elite families who consolidated control over agricultural and trade resources. In this view, kingship was not a sudden institution, but a process of gradual centralization shaped by economic necessity, regional competition, and external pressure from neighboring states. Assyrian records later mention Hamath as a recognized political entity, often in the context of tribute, resistance, or incorporation into imperial structures. These references confirm its existence as a kingdom, but they provide limited insight into how its earliest ruling lines were established or how authority was first legitimized. And here, the historical silence becomes more noticeable. There are no surviving royal archives from Hamath's earliest dynasties, no detailed king lists comparable to those of Mesopotamia. Instead, the early political identity of the kingdom must be reconstructed through fragments, inscriptions from later periods, archaeological remains of administrative buildings, and comparative analysis with neighboring Aramaean states. This absence of direct testimony has led to multiple interpretive approaches. Some scholars argue that Hamath's early dynastic structure likely mirrored other Aramaean polities, where kingship emerged through a combination of tribal leadership, control of agricultural surplus, and strategic positioning along trade routes. Authority may have been fluid at first, consolidating only gradually into more stable dynastic rule. Others point to the possibility that early Hamath was not a single unified kingdom in its initial stages, but rather a collection of interconnected settlements that slowly coalesced under a dominant center. In such a scenario, the dynasty would represent the later formalization of leadership over a pre-existing network of communities, rather than the founding of a state from a single origin point. More speculative interpretations occasionally arise from the gaps in the record. Could early Hamath have experienced periods of fragmented authority, where multiple local rulers governed different districts before centralization occurred? Might early dynastic memory have been reshaped or lost during later political transitions, especially under Assyrian dominance? While these ideas remain unproven, They highlight the difficulty of reconstructing political evolution in regions where written documentation begins only after significant development has already taken place. Archaeological research continues to refine this picture. Excavations in and around Hama reveal long-term occupation sequences, showing continuity in settlement patterns alongside shifts in architectural style and material culture. These changes suggest gradual political and social transformation rather than abrupt state formation. Yet the earliest institutional framework remains elusive, as if the foundations of kingship were built over earlier structures that have not yet been fully uncovered. Perhaps the most enduring mystery of Hamath is not its later historical prominence, but the quiet, undocumented moment when leadership first began to crystallize into dynasty. Somewhere beneath the modern city and the riverbanks of the Orontes, traces of those earliest rulers may still exist, hidden beneath layers of continuous habitation, waiting for archaeology to reveal how a kingdom begins not with grand declarations, but with slow, almost invisible shifts in power that history only recognizes long after they have taken place. As the earliest dynasties of Hamath fade into the slow current of the Orontes, our journey shifts once more toward the northern frontier of the ancient Levant. The landscape here changes subtly but significantly. River valleys narrow into more confined corridors, hills rise more abruptly, and the air carries a sense of transition between fertile lowlands and the highlands beyond. It is a region shaped by movement, of people, armies, and ideas. In this liminal space lies Tel Dan, a site whose early political history is both partially illuminated and deeply uncertain. The mound of Tel Dan sits quietly in northern Palestine, near the sources of the Jordan River, where water emerges from limestone springs and spreads into marshy wetlands before forming defined channels. Even today, the site is marked by a striking sense of presence. Ancient stone walls emerge from the earth in layered sequences, while reconstructed gateways hint at the architectural ambition of earlier inhabitants. Standing here, one can sense the strategic importance of the location, a natural entry point between regions, controlling access through river routes and mountain passes. Archaeological excavations have revealed that Tel Dan was occupied continuously for thousands of years, with particularly significant phases during the Bronze and Iron Ages. Among its most notable discoveries is a massive mud brick gate complex dating to the Middle Bronze Age, one of the largest known in the region. This structure suggests the presence of an organized and fortified settlement, likely governed by a structured political authority capable of mobilizing labor and resources on a substantial scale. Yet the question that continues to shape discussions about Tel Dan is not only what it was, but what became of its earliest political formation. In the late Bronze and early Iron Age transition, the broader Levant underwent profound changes. Large palace-centered systems of the late Bronze Age declined, trade networks were disrupted, and new local polities began to emerge. It is within this transformation that Tel Dan appears to shift from a fortified urban center into a smaller, though still strategically significant, settlement associated with emerging Aramaean political structures. Biblical and extra-biblical references identify the region of Dan as part of shifting territorial boundaries during the early Iron Age. Later inscriptions, including the famous Tel Dan stele discovered at the site, refer to conflicts involving regional kings and provide rare glimpses into the political landscape of the 9th century BC. This inscription, attributed to an Aramaean ruler, mentions military victories over neighboring territories and offers one of the earliest known external references to dynastic struggles in the region. But these later records also highlight a deeper absence. What remains unclear is the nature of Tel Dan's earliest political identity before these inscriptions appear. Was it originally a local city-state with its own dynastic leadership? Or was it part of a broader regional network governed by shifting alliances between highland and lowland communities? Mainstream archaeological interpretation suggests that Tel Dan began as a Canaanite urban center during the Bronze Age, integrated into larger regional systems that connected northern Palestine with inland Syria and coastal trade routes. During the collapse of these systems at the end of the late Bronze Age, many cities experienced decline, abandonment, or transformation. Tel Dan, however, appears to have retained some level of continuity, though in altered form. This continuity is visible in the material record. Excavations show that certain architectural features were reused across different periods, suggesting that later inhabitants built upon earlier structures rather than completely replacing them. Pottery sequences indicate gradual cultural transitions rather than abrupt replacement. Agricultural installations and water systems also show long-term adaptation to the site's natural resources, particularly its abundant springs, which would have made it a valuable settlement even during periods of regional instability. Yet continuity does not fully explain the political disappearance of its earliest kingdom-like structure. At some point between the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, the nature of authority at Tel Dan seems to have changed. The evidence suggests a shift from a centralized urban system to a more fragmented or regionally integrated form of governance. Whether this transition was peaceful, gradual, or shaped by external pressure remains difficult to determine with certainty. What happened to the ruling structure that once controlled the fortified Middle Bronze Age city? Mainstream explanations often point to the broader collapse of late Bronze Age political systems across the eastern Mediterranean. Trade disruptions, population movements, and shifting climatic conditions are frequently cited as contributing factors. In this view, Tel Dan's early political organization may have dissolved not through a single catastrophic event, but through long-term systemic change that redefined how power was distributed across the region. However, the archaeological record leaves room for further questions. Some layers at the site suggest episodes of destruction or abrupt change, while others indicate continuity of occupation. This mixture of signals complicates attempts to define a single narrative of collapse. It raises the possibility that Tel Dan's transformation was uneven, with different parts of its population adapting in different ways to regional instability. Could it be that the collapse was not a single moment, but a series of localized adjustments unfolding over generations? More speculative interpretations occasionally explore alternative possibilities. Some researchers have suggested that early political centers in regions like Tel Dan may have been part of loosely connected networks, rather than strictly centralized kingdoms, meaning that what appears as collapse in the archaeological record might actually reflect a reorganization of authority, rather than its disappearance. Others have proposed that certain political traditions may have continued in nearby settlements, even as the main fortified center declined in prominence. There is also the question of memory and identity. How did later inhabitants of Tel Dan understand the remains of earlier monumental architecture? Did they recognize them as relics of a former political order, or simply as inherited structures repurposed for new social realities? Archaeology can reveal what was built and rebuilt, but it cannot fully reconstruct how past societies interpreted their own history. Modern excavations continue to refine the timeline. Advances in stratigraphic analysis and radiocarbon dating are helping to clarify the sequence of occupation and transition phases. Yet even with these tools, the earliest political identity of Tel Dan remains partially obscured, as if the site preserves the physical layers of history more clearly than its political narrative. Perhaps the most enduring mystery is not whether Tel Dan experienced collapse or continuity, but how its earliest kingdom-like structure transformed into something less defined without leaving a clear record of its own dissolution. Somewhere beneath the springs and stone foundations of the site, traces of its earliest political world may still exist, waiting quietly beneath centuries of rebuilding, asking whether the disappearance of a kingdom is always an ending, or sometimes only the beginning of a different form of existence that history has yet to fully recognize. As the uncertain political layers of Tel Dan fade into the shifting frontier zones of the northern Levant, the landscape begins to open once again, this time into a far more elemental world. The terrain stretches outward into vast desert silence, broken only by sandstone towers, wind-carved ridges, and valleys etched over millennia by rare and unpredictable rains. It is a place where time itself feels exposed, where human presence is recorded not in cities or monuments, but in marks pressed directly into stone. Here, in the southern reaches of modern Jordan, lies Wadi Rum, a landscape that preserves one of the most visually striking and archaeologically complex collections of Iron Age rock carvings in the Near East. Wadi Rum is not a setting that hides its history easily. Towering sandstone cliffs rise like frozen waves of stone, their surfaces glowing red and gold under shifting sunlight. Narrow canyons cut through the desert floor, opening into wide basins where seasonal water once gathered. Even today, the silence here feels dense, almost physical, as if the landscape itself is holding memory in suspension. Along cliff faces and sheltered rock panels, thousands of inscriptions and carvings appear, some simple, others highly stylized, all etched by hands that lived in a world now only partially understood. These carvings span a broad chronological range, but many are associated with Iron Age nomadic and semi-nomadic groups who moved through the region between roughly the early 1st millennium BC and the later pre-classical periods. They are not the work of a single culture or centralized authority, but rather a mosaic of tribal expressions, Thamudic, Safavidic, and other early North Arabian inscriptions, alongside petroglyphs depicting animals, human figures, symbols, and abstract forms. At first glance, many of these markings appear straightforward. Camels, ibexes, hunters, and armed figures dominate the imagery. Some scenes depict mounted individuals with spears or bows, suggesting mobility, survival, and the importance of hunting and herding in desert life. Other carvings show processions of animals or repeated symbolic motifs that may have held ritual or clan significance. Inscriptions, often brief, record names, prayers, or territorial markers, silent declarations of presence in an otherwise vast and unmarked environment. Yet the more closely these carvings are studied, the more questions begin to emerge. Unlike monumental inscriptions of settled kingdoms, the rock art of Wadi Rum is decentralized, scattered, and often isolated. There is no single narrative, no unified political message, no central architectural framework. Instead, there is repetition of themes across great distances, suggesting shared cultural patterns among mobile groups whose movements were shaped by water sources, grazing routes, and seasonal cycles. Mainstream archaeological interpretation understands these carvings primarily as expressions of nomadic life, records of passage, identity, and communication in a landscape where permanent settlement was limited. In this view, the rock panels functioned as a kind of open-air archive, marking routes, commemorating individuals, and asserting presence in contested or shared territories. The inscriptions, written in early North Arabian scripts, support this interpretation by revealing personal names, short dedications, and occasional references to tribal affiliation. But even within this framework, important uncertainties remain. Why do certain symbols recur across widely separated locations? Why do some panels appear to have been deliberately chosen for repeated engraving over long periods, while others remain untouched despite similar environmental conditions? And why do certain motifs, such as stylized human figures with exaggerated proportions or abstract geometric arrangements, appear without clear parallels in neighboring settled cultures? These questions have led to a range of interpretive approaches. Some scholars suggest that the carvings represent more than simple territorial markings. They may reflect complex social networks among Iron Age tribes, where shared symbols functioned as identifiers across vast and shifting landscapes. In this interpretation, Wadi Rum becomes less a collection of isolated artworks and more a distributed cultural system, one in which meaning was carried through mobility rather than permanence. Others emphasize the ritual dimension of the rock art. Certain panels are located in visually prominent or acoustically distinctive locations, places where wind funnels through narrow canyons or where sight lines extend across long desert corridors. These positions may not be accidental. Some researchers propose that specific sites could have held ceremonial or communicative significance, functioning as gathering points, storytelling locations, or markers of spiritual geography within nomadic belief systems. While difficult to confirm, such interpretations highlight the possibility that these carvings were embedded in a broader worldview that connected landscape, memory, and identity. There are also more speculative perspectives that occasionally arise in discussions of desert rock art. Could some of these carvings encode navigational knowledge, preserving information about water sources, seasonal movement routes, or territorial boundaries in symbolic form? Or might certain repeated motifs reflect mythological or cosmological ideas shared across dispersed tribal groups? While direct evidence remains limited, the consistency of certain patterns across time and space invites continued exploration of how meaning was transmitted in non-literate or semi-literate societies. Another layer of complexity comes from the sheer temporal depth of the site. Wadi Rum was not used by a single generation or even a single historical period. Many of the carvings overlap, intersect, or partially obscure earlier markings. This creates a visual stratigraphy on rock surfaces, an accumulation of human presence layered across centuries. In some cases, newer inscriptions are carved directly over older ones, suggesting shifting patterns of occupation, reinterpretation, or even deliberate erasure. The rock faces themselves become living documents, continuously rewritten by successive travelers. And yet, despite extensive study, large portions of this record remain only partially deciphered. The erosion of sandstone surfaces, combined with the fragmentary nature of short inscriptions, means that many carvings cannot be fully interpreted. Some symbols resist classification entirely, existing outside known typologies. Even when individual words or names can be translated, their broader context often remains uncertain. Modern archaeological efforts continue to document and analyze these carvings using advanced imaging techniques, 3D modeling, and digital mapping. These tools are gradually revealing patterns that were previously invisible: clusters of inscriptions along ancient routes, correlations between carving styles and geographic features, and potential sequences of use across time. Yet even with these advances, the fundamental questions remain open. Who first decided to carve meaning into these stones? Was it necessity, an effort to navigate and survive in a vast and challenging environment, or something deeper, an impulse to leave trace, identity, and memory in a place that offered no permanence? And how many of these messages were intended for others at all, rather than for the landscape itself? Perhaps the most enduring mystery of Wadi Rum is not what is carved into its stone, but what is absent from it. Entire worlds of movement, belief, and social structure once passed through these valleys without leaving written chronicles, relying instead on symbols, paths, and oral memory that no longer fully survive. The rock remains, but the meaning behind many of its marks continues to drift just beyond reach. Somewhere among the cliffs and canyons, under shifting light and desert wind, these carvings still wait, quiet fragments of Iron Age lives inscribed into stone, asking not to be solved in a single explanation, but to be understood as part of a much larger and still unfinished conversation between people, landscape, and time itself. As the carved narratives of Wadi Rum dissolve into the silence of the desert wind, our journey shifts northward once again, returning to the complex political landscapes of the Iron Age Levant. Here, the terrain changes from open desert to a mosaic of highlands, river valleys, and fortified settlements, lands where kings rose and fell in rapid succession, and where dynasties were often remembered more through their enemies than their own records. It is within this fragmented historical record that the legacy of the House of Omri emerges, and, more intriguingly, its uncertain and often elusive successors. The House of Omri first appears in the historical record during the 9th century BC, associated with the formation of a powerful kingdom in the northern highlands of what is today Palestine. Founded by Omri, a military leader who established a new capital at Samaria, this dynasty quickly became one of the most politically significant forces in the region. Archaeological evidence from Samaria reveals an organized urban center, with administrative buildings, finely constructed architecture, and material culture that reflects strong economic and political integration. Under Omri and his successors, the kingdom expanded its influence through alliances, military campaigns, and regional diplomacy. Assyrian inscriptions refer to this polity in external records, often in the context of tribute, conflict, or shifting alliances. In these texts, the rulers of this kingdom are identified as part of a recognizable dynastic line, known today through historical reconstruction rather than continuous native documentation. Yet, as the narrative progresses, something begins to shift. Later historical records continue to reference the kingdom, but the clarity surrounding its internal dynastic succession becomes increasingly fragmented. Names appear, disappear, and reappear in different contexts. Political stability seems to give way to periods of internal tension, external pressure, and shifting leadership structures. By the time of intensified Assyrian expansion in the 8th century BC, the kingdom is described as both politically significant and increasingly unstable. The final phase of the House of Omri is often associated with the fall of Samaria in 722 BC, when Assyrian forces under Sargon II captured the capital after a prolonged siege. Assyrian records describe the deportation of large segments of the population and the restructuring of the region into imperial provinces. In these accounts, the dynastic line of Omri effectively disappears from the political stage. But disappearance in imperial records does not necessarily mean complete historical absence. What happened to the successors of the House of Omri after the fall of Samaria? Mainstream historical interpretation suggests that the ruling elite was either killed, exiled, or absorbed into the administrative systems of the Assyrian Empire. The policy of deportation, well documented in Assyrian practice, often relocated conquered populations across vast distances, dispersing political and cultural identities into new regions. In this framework, the successors of the Omride dynasty ceased to exist as a governing body, even if individuals survived in exile or administrative service. However, the archaeological and textual record leaves room for deeper uncertainty. The Assyrian annals, while detailed in describing conquest, are far less clear about the long-term fate of displaced elites. Names associated with the royal house vanish from direct mention, but administrative continuity in the region suggests that local governance structures were not entirely erased. Instead, they were reconfigured under imperial oversight. This raises the question of whether elements of the former ruling class may have persisted in altered roles, embedded within the new system rather than fully removed from it. Some scholars propose that the successors of the House of Omri may not be a single identifiable lineage at all, but rather a series of fragmented political identities that continued under changing conditions. In this view, dynastic continuity becomes less about bloodline and more about administrative memory, titles, roles, and regional authority that survive even as political sovereignty disappears. There are also more interpretive perspectives that explore how identity itself may have evolved after the fall. Could cultural and administrative traditions associated with the Omride period have continued among local populations even after imperial restructuring? Material culture in the region suggests a degree of continuity in daily life, even as political structures changed. Pottery styles, architectural practices, and agricultural systems often persist beyond the collapse of ruling dynasties, carried forward by communities who experience political change without necessarily undergoing immediate cultural rupture. At the same time, Assyrian provincial records hint at the presence of local administrators who governed under imperial authority. While these figures are not always clearly linked to earlier dynasties, their emergence raises the possibility that former elites may have adapted to new political realities, rather than disappearing entirely. More speculative interpretations occasionally explore the idea that memory of the Omride dynasty may have survived in regional traditions, preserved indirectly through oral history or place-based identity. While such ideas are difficult to verify, they reflect a broader pattern in ancient history. Political collapse does not always equate to cultural erasure. Modern archaeology continues to refine this picture through ongoing excavations at Samaria and surrounding sites. Stratigraphic evidence reveals continuity across the transition from independent kingdom to imperial province, suggesting that the transformation was complex rather than abrupt. Yet the precise identity of those who governed in the immediate aftermath of the Assyrian conquest remains difficult to reconstruct. Perhaps the most enduring mystery is not the fall of the House of Omri, but the quiet uncertainty surrounding what came after it. Between the lines of imperial inscriptions and the layers of archaeological remains lies a period of transition that is still only partially understood, a space where former rulers may have become administrators, displaced elites may have become dispersed communities, and political identity may have slowly dissolved into something less visible but not entirely erased. Somewhere beneath the ruins of Samaria and the broader landscape of the northern highlands, traces of this transformation still linger, asking whether a dynasty truly ends when it loses its throne, or whether it continues in altered forms that history has not yet learned how to fully recognize. As the fragmented legacy of the House of Omri fades into the layered history of imperial transitions, our path turns once again toward the arid expanses of northwestern Arabia. The landscape shifts dramatically, away from the highlands and river valleys of the Levant into a world defined by stone plateaus, shifting dunes, and vast silence broken only by wind and the distant memory of water. Here lies Tayma, an oasis settlement that once stood as a vital node in ancient trade networks, and yet whose earliest phases carry a lingering question that continues to resist simple explanation. Why did its surrounding settlements experience repeated cycles of decline and apparent desertification? Tayma itself remains one of the most prominent oases of the northern Arabian Peninsula. Even today, its palm groves and cultivated fields form a striking contrast against the surrounding desert. Ancient walls, inscriptions, and archaeological layers reveal a settlement that has been occupied for thousands of years, serving at different times as a local center, a trade hub, and a point of contact between Arabian, Mesopotamian, and Levantine worlds. Its position along caravan routes made it both strategically valuable and environmentally vulnerable. But beyond the core oasis, archaeology reveals a more complex and less stable picture. Surrounding Tayma are traces of earlier settlements, smaller habitation sites, agricultural zones, and seasonal encampments that appear to have been occupied intermittently during the Bronze and Early Iron Age periods, roughly the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. These peripheral settlements show evidence of farming activity, water management systems, and temporary architectural structures. Yet many of them also show signs of abandonment, sometimes followed by later reoccupation, and in some cases, complete disappearance beneath advancing desert sands. This pattern raises a fundamental question. What caused these cycles of settlement and decline? Mainstream archaeological interpretation points first to environmental variability. The Arabian Peninsula has long experienced fluctuations in rainfall patterns, groundwater recharge, and climatic stability. Even small shifts in precipitation could have had profound effects on marginal agricultural zones surrounding oases like Tayma. In such fragile ecosystems, overuse of groundwater or prolonged dry periods could gradually reduce the viability of peripheral settlements, forcing populations to concentrate closer to the main water source or relocate entirely. In this view, desertification is not a sudden event, but a slow ecological process. Settlements on the edges of the oasis would have been the first to feel these pressures. Fields would shrink. Wells would become less reliable. Seasonal camps might shift their routes. Over generations, areas that once supported small communities could become too unstable for continued habitation, leaving behind only faint archaeological traces. Yet the archaeological record does not always present a smooth or uniform decline. Some peripheral sites show abrupt cessation of activity rather than gradual reduction. Others appear to have been reoccupied after long gaps, suggesting that environmental conditions may not have been the only factor at play. In certain layers, there is evidence of organized abandonment, structures left intact, tools left behind, and no clear signs of destruction or conflict. This raises the possibility that social or economic factors also played a role in shaping settlement patterns. Could shifts in trade routes have altered the importance of specific satellite settlements around Tayma? As long-distance caravan networks evolved, certain routes may have become more dominant, while others declined in significance. Settlements that once served as resting points or agricultural support zones for passing caravans might have lost their function if traffic patterns changed. In such a system, environmental stress and economic restructuring could have reinforced one another, accelerating abandonment. There is also the question of water management knowledge. Oasis systems depend not only on natural groundwater, but also on human understanding of how to distribute and sustain it. Some researchers have suggested that changes in political authority or population movement could have disrupted traditional knowledge systems related to irrigation and water extraction. If expertise was lost or fragmented, even temporarily, it may have contributed to localized settlement failure in surrounding areas. More speculative interpretations occasionally emerge when examining these patterns. Could some phases of abandonment reflect deliberate withdrawal rather than environmental collapse? In certain historical contexts, communities have chosen to consolidate around more secure water sources or defensible positions, leaving peripheral zones intentionally unoccupied. While difficult to verify archaeologically, such decisions could leave similar material signatures to environmental decline. Others have proposed that long-term climatic cycles, not yet fully resolved in regional paleoclimate data, may have produced alternating periods of expansion and contraction in habitable zones around Tayma. These cycles might not have been dramatic enough to leave clear catastrophe layers, but sufficient to reshape settlement geography over centuries. Modern research continues to explore these questions through sediment analysis, paleohydrological reconstruction, and satellite-based landscape studies. These methods are gradually revealing hidden channels, ancient irrigation traces, and subtle environmental shifts that are not immediately visible on the surface. Yet even with these tools, the full sequence of occupation and abandonment around Tayma remains only partially reconstructed. What is increasingly clear is that Tayma was never a static oasis surrounded by empty desert. It was a dynamic system, expanding and contracting in response to environmental, economic, and social pressures that operated on different timescales. Some settlements disappeared quickly. Others lingered in reduced form. Still others re-emerged after long intervals, suggesting resilience as well as vulnerability. Perhaps the most enduring mystery is not why some settlements around Tayma were abandoned, but how many cycles of occupation and disappearance occurred before the pattern stabilized into what we see today. Beneath the desert surface, buried traces of earlier fields, dwellings, and water systems may still remain. Silent records of communities that adapted, withdrew, returned, or vanished, leaving behind a landscape that continues to ask whether desertification is an ending or simply one phase in a much longer and still unfolding history of human survival in extreme environments.